Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And I'm sure you recognize a familiar face with us today. We have a recurring guest and friend, Lars Nielsen. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me again today. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, we are excited too. And we've had this on the books for how long, Landon? I'm not kidding. Like I had a tooth
We've been
infection,
trying
you had
for
a
a couple
kidney
months.
stone, something, and I keep having to like message Lars. I'm sure he's like, okay, one time postpone. Yeah, two times. Three times. I mean, it's our reputation as Mormonish is suffering. So, but I promise you, every one of our ailments is true. We're falling apart, podcasting and being older. And so we're just happy that we're alive and kicking, right, Landon? And we can have Lars on finally.
Yeah.
Well, you guys look great. I just had a nice, fun pre-conversation with you
That's
guys.
right.
I'm glad that you're doing really well. I'm glad that you're healthy, and it's worth the wait.
Yep, it's worth the wait. There it is. I know. I love pre-conversations on the podcast, and I always feel like, dang, there's so much good stuff in those. We should just let it roll, right? So anyway, it's great. So for those of you who don't know who Lars is, I can't imagine there's too many that don't. We podcasted with him. When was it? When did your book first come out?
This would be April of last year, 2020.
That's right. I was going to say in the spring of last year. Still got it. Here it is right here. How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass, the second greatest show on earth. And this kind of hit with a splash. A lot of people were really interested in purchasing it and reading it. And it really brought out a lot of conversations about different things. There were so many interesting and new things that were brought up. Then at Sunstone, we got to see you present again. And that was really interesting. And I thought, I was impressed by all the questions that people, you kind of said, and now if anyone has a question, line up right here, like whoosh, there was this line of people, and
That's
some people
true.
were pushing back on some of the stuff you'd said. Some people had further questions, but that's the beauty of any kind of book that comes out. You can read it and you can take from it what you will, and you can try to find out more. So there's definitely been a lot of dialogue. Do you want to speak to that for a second, Landon, on the different kind of things that we've seen out there? It was a disruptor. That's what it was. It was definitely a disruptor. So
Yeah, obviously when the book came out, there was a lot of excitement, a lot, you mentioned that there were a lot of new things, probably things a lot of regular post-Mormons had never heard of before, regarding some names, Kucher and Abe Nephi and all these Mormars and all of these different names that came out. But as we went through it originally, as you said, this is a book to open discussions, and as part of scholarship, we always like to see all ideas out there, and then we get to talk about them and say this one's good, that one's not. A lot of people I know have read your book and said, "Oh, I this points out a lot of things I never knew before." There's other people. Dan Vogel is obviously one who says, "Oh, no, this is not." And we've talked to Dan. Dan knows we're doing this episode with it. We've had several conversations with him about it, but we like to let the conversation, the dialogue go where it may. And it's always interesting to hear what everyone thinks in the comments as we have the discussions, because you see both sides. So
yeah, one thing that I like is that new information that I'm going to present to you today can really help people, regardless of which camp you find yourself in, maybe the Spalding theory camp or the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory camp or the Smith-Soule authorship camp. The information can help you adjust and iterate how you think about the theories and the sub-theories within the theories, because we're all on a spectrum. There aren't just one theory here and one theory here. There is a spectrum of theories, and wherever you are on that spectrum, I hope that this new information will cause you to think somewhat differently and then to refine your thinking. Some of you might change your minds and even switch camps, and over time we'll get closer to the truth. And that's my biggest goal with all of this.
yeah, no, I think that's really great. And like Landon mentioned with Dan Vogel, he actually had made a couple videos addressing some of the new information that you put out in your book. And then you put out a video and some other information. So it's really, for those that have been following
like
it,
sparring going back and forth.
It is back and forth, back and forth. But that's great. You know what I mean?
I'm trying to do it as patiently and respectfully as I can.
That's exactly right. No, it's really good, because I feel like, we always try to welcome scholars, anybody that wants to come on our show with different points of view. And it's hard to get people to come on and talk, especially if they know that there might be different points of view expressed. But I mean, I think about it, Bill Reel just started a podcast on Wednesday mornings where he's inviting apologists to come on and talk about topics. I don't think he's gotten one person that will come on, and that's the thing. If you put something out there or believe something, go and talk about it. It just breaks things open, and it's great. And I will say that the particular interest that Landon and I have in this book is the connection to BYU and to the BYU library, because that's where I spent many years working. And we feel that there's some really interesting information there when Lars talks about in his book BYU being so interested in some of the information Lars puts out. So regardless of what that information is, BYU had an interest. BYU felt there might have been something to it and took steps, which maybe we'll get into. And so that's very interesting.
A lot of items and to hide a lot of information.
That's what I'm saying, to hide a lot of it. So regardless of, is the information accurate, real, truthful, the church through BYU thought it might have been. And, we have records of the steps that they took. So that means they knew there was something. So that's kind of my interest. Do you think I expressed that right, Landon? Is that kind of how you feel?
Yeah, definitely. And we've actually heard from some people or a person who says they were part of that. They were looking into this, working with the BYU staff, trying to find some of this stuff. Unfortunately, he didn't identify himself. He said he would easily be noticed, but he gave us enough information. The names he were using, Rebecca worked with him at BYU.
Yeah.
And that in itself, she knew all the names he was talking about. So he definitely had an insider information of BYU and some of this stuff. And as we get into this, we'll talk about that a little bit more, because he made some claims that we've not been able to substantiate, but we are definitely interested to see if there's anyone out there who could help substantiate some of those claims.
Right. And what he was talking about tracked with some of the things that Lars was saying in the book about BYU. And so that's why we're particularly interested. So we will let Lars take it away now. We've talked too much. And again, this is, kind of a response to some of the things that other people have put out, and it'll be really interesting, I think.
Okay. So let me just go ahead and zoom ahead to this slide. This is, if you want to see the Sunstone presentation that you were just referring to, you can go to my website, www.howthebookofmormoncametopass.com. And in the collection of videos near the top, you'll see the thumbnail of the Sunstone presentation.
Okay.
Right next to the thumbnail of the podcast that I did with you guys here on Mormonish in April. And but today I'm really going to focus on two things. One, I'm going to present some new analysis and new observations that haven't been published anywhere or discussed on any podcast yet, first on Mormonish. And two, I'm going to share some snippets from a video that I released a month and a half ago called But Who Will Monitor the Monitors? And that is my part one response to Dan Vogel's two-part review of my book. I've got lots more to do. He did a two-part review. I've got multiple parts coming, but that's my first part, and it's rather long and it's in depth. It's 4 hours long. We're going to be more brief with things here, but this is going to tease you into that. And so I wanted you to know where it is, because we're going to be sharing some clips from it today. And if you want to go deep in it, maybe you want to pause it, do that now, or if you want to watch this video first and then go into it, I want you to know where you can go to get that. So I'm going to actually start by talking about a conversation I had with Dan McClellan after the keynote address that he gave at Sunstone. And I actually summarized a little bit of that conversation in a short clip that I'm going to use with you to get things started. So here it is. And let me make sure that the audio comes through.
In that conversation, he said that he did not think that Joseph Smith had composed the Book of Mormon, that he read or dictated it to his scribes, yes, but that he composed it, no. I asked him whether he favored any specific authorship theory, perhaps one involving the Smith family, Solomon Spalding, Dartmouth, or Sidney Rigdon. He then said that he has decided not to focus on the origin of the Book of Mormon academically or online. I did not press him on his reasons for staying quiet about this view, but I did confirm with him again, for good measure, in case I had misheard him, that he doesn't think that Joseph Smith composed the Book of Mormon. Of course, I don't speak for Dan McClellan, and I am not suggesting that he has in any way, shape, or form endorsed my book, He had not read it by the time we spoke. I only bring this up to make the point that he is a very well-respected professional who, having been trained in cognitive linguistics, textual criticism, and the science of religion, does not reside in the Smith sole authorship camp, which he freely disclosed to me at a well-respected conference and not under any confidentiality.
All right. So I included that clip more than anything so that the Mormonish audience can know that there are professionals out there with actual academic degrees who are Mormon, and some of them who are post-Mormon, who strongly disagree with Mr. Vogel's claim that all of the sentences within the Book of Mormon were composed by Joseph Smith alone. Of course, I'm not saying that people without any degrees, like Mr. Vogel, can't be right about some things, even many things. Obviously, he can. Mr. Vogel's contribution with early Mormon documents was invaluable, and I will always be grateful to him for that. And I am grateful to him for pointing out mistakes that I have made so that I, as a non-historian myself, can improve my admittedly imperfect theory over time. That said, should Mr. Vogel continue to deliberately mischaracterize my theory online, then I'm going to continue to show, as patiently as I can, the error of those ways. But before we get into some of those mischaracterizations, I want to share some new observations that, to my knowledge, have never been discussed on any podcast, which I think your audience in particular will be fascinated by. So, Rebecca or Landon, have either of you ever heard of James Macpherson?
James Macpherson. I don't think I have. Have you, Landon?
No, he looks like a founding father, but
or at least that era.
Yeah. I would venture to guess, that most Mormons have never heard of him. And so here's another quick summary, a little snippet that I pulled out of that one video that I was telling you before that you can find on my website.
Who is James Macpherson? He's an infamous Scottish writer who composed a vast work of epic poems in 2 volumes that he claimed to have discovered and translated from ancient Gaelic sources, when in reality, he made up the whole thing. It was first published in 1761, the year that Spalding was born, and was quite famous in Europe and among the literati of the United States for about 50 years. The stories center around Fingal, the hero, as narrated by Ossian, whose name Macpherson derived by manipulating syllables and dropping letters from Oisin, who is generally regarded as the most legendary poet and bard in all of Ireland. Some regarded this new Ossian, whom again Macpherson had invented, to be the Celtic equivalent of Homer. Even Thomas Jefferson said in 1773, "I am not ashamed to own that I think this rude bard of the North the greatest poet that has ever existed." In contrast, at about the time that Spalding was attending Dartmouth, Samuel Johnson famously repudiated Macpherson, calling him a mountebank, a liar, and a fraud. Using textual evidences, Johnson concluded that Macpherson's 2 books, Fingal and Timora, together constituted as gross an imposition as ever the world was troubled with.
Okay, so here we have a Scottish writer, James Macpherson, who recognized that Scotland and Ireland didn't have any ancient literature around which to form a shared cultural heritage. Macpherson fully understood what Homer's Iliad did for the Greeks and what Virgil's Aeneid did for the Romans, which inspired him, Macpherson, to write his own epic fiction for the Scottish and the Irish, which he presented as a compiled abridgment of lost ancient manuscripts that he claimed to have found and then translated into English, which should sound pretty familiar. But what started out as a relatively innocent compilation project quickly got out of hand, with Macpherson integrating bits and pieces of authentic Scottish and Irish mythology together into one grand epic narrative that eventually claimed for itself to be much more than it actually was. But because an entire region was so excited to finally have its own native history, Macpherson had little choice but to double down on his white lie. Solomon Spalding, I contend, was strongly influenced by Macpherson while writing his own epic stories from lost manuscripts found, which assertion can be supported by much textual evidence, and I just go that into do a deep dive into that part 1 video I was telling you about. Like Macpherson, Spalding recognized that his country's native peoples did not have any ancient literature around which to form a shared cultural heritage. Consequently, he also saw an opportunity to compose an American Aeneid, which he structured as if it were a compiled abridgment of lost manuscripts that the narrator claimed to have found and then translated into English. In setting out to write an epic and biblical romance, Spalding, like most writers of fiction, wanted to do a good enough job that the common man would get lost in it, that get caught up in it, believing that it could be genuine history and a legitimate offshoot of the Bible. For Spalding, tying his pseudo-history to, for example, the Tower of Babel, the murdered sons of Zedekiah, and the destruction of Jerusalem wasn't dishonest, it was just clever because he was just writing fiction. Right now, however, I want to focus on the most important proper nouns that Macpherson made up in his Fingal and Tamora, because, as we shall see, Spalding emulated Macpherson's linguistic patterns and even borrowed some of his made-up words while writing his own manuscripts found, which includes the Mormon story. The following clip is about 10 minutes long, but I think that it's important for understanding what Macpherson was trying to do and consequently for understanding what Spalding was trying to do, but we can pause and talk about it if you want early at any time. So here's that.
By far, the most striking syllable throughout both books, which are organized as books inside of books, by the way, is more, M-O-R, which I have placed in the middle of the slide. At the top of this alphabetical list is Camorra, which should be pronounced the way the British do, who say motor car instead of motor car. And what does Camorra mean? Fortunately, Macpherson tells us the etymology of Camorra in his footnotes, which he plausibly constructs from Gaelic syllables. Here he says that Camorra comes from Carn, moor, meaning high rocky hill. Fortunately, from other words, we learn that Car means rocky hill, and moor means great. In the first edition of the Book of Mormon, the hill Camorra was first spelled C-A-M-O-R-A-H and had the same pronunciation as Macpherson's Camorra. As you can see here, it was changed by an early scribe to an altered spelling for whatever reason. We have multiple indications that Spalding had read Macpherson's epic before writing his own, but there is no evidence or even reason to suspect that Smith had ever read Macpherson. Putting a hill from Macpherson's epic story into his own is just the kind of thing that Spalding would have done. But let's look at more words. According to Macpherson, Cathmore translates to great battle, from Cath meaning battle and more again meaning great. Clessamore, he says, means mighty deeds, with more meaning mighty here, which is pretty synonymous with great. Conmore contains con, which usually means warrior or hound, so Conmore means great warrior. One particular Conmore, however, in the story comes from a minority dialect. Canmore, we are told, means mild and tall, with con meaning mild and more again meaning great, but this time in the sense of height. Cremora means a woman of great soul, with cre meaning soul and mora meaning great woman. Dooth Carmore means dark Carmore, or dark high rocky hill. In this case, it is a place name that has been converted into a person name. Lamor means great hand, with lam meaning hand. Lamhor, with an H, is a variant of Lamhor, where the H changes the meaning from great to mighty. Spalding will also change the or suffix to the hor suffix for some of his fictional names. Larthmore means great sea, with Larth meaning sea, and more, yep, you guessed it, means great. Larthmore is the name Ossian gives to the great sea king who befriends Fingal. Malmore, interestingly, means great hill. Wait, didn't Carmora mean great hill? According to Macpherson, they both do. Rocky hills in Scotland and grassy hills in Ireland seemingly have their own words. Mora means a great plain or heath. The text suggests that the word was originally a fusion of moor and ruh, where ruh would mean kingdom or of the kings. In the text, we have the chief of Mora, the heath of Mora, the deer of Mora, the towers of Mora, the breezes of Mora, the hills of Mora, Mora's rock, Mora's mist, and Mora's wind. It is apparently very mossy. Many battles are fought on the plains of Mora. Scouts ascend the hills of Mora as they look for vantage points, etc. Now recall that, quote, the land of Moron in the Book of Mormon is, quote, where the king dwelt. This is a detail that is directly borrowed from Macpherson's Mora, the great land of the kings. Spalding, of course, changed the ending to on in his manuscripts found, because it sounds more biblically derived, like Sidon, Zion, etc. Inmora is short for Inis Mora, which means great island. Moran has 5 meanings. 1, someone from Mora. 2, greatness. 3, a mighty man. 4, signifying many. And 5, one of the sons of Phithel. Morar means both great man and a man of Mora. Morla means place of worship, with the syllables literally meaning either great place or great stone, or both. In other words, an altar. Morla is also a minor character. Notice how Morla and Lamor above exhibit syllable swapping. This is also the case with Karos and Oscar. Karos is one of the first heroes and Oscar is one of the last, so a little syllable swapping here and there adds to the fun of it all. Morlath means great in the day of battle. It is very similar to Cathmor, which means great in battle. Morlath is also a minor character. Here again, we have some imperfect syllable swaps. Larthmor goes to Morlath, and Morlath goes to Lathmon. Morna means a woman of Mora. It is also the wife of Comal, daughter of King Cormac, and the mother of Fingal. Morni is the chief of the Morni tribe. He has many sons, though some passages also refer to the daughters of Morni. Gaul, the greatest of all the sons of Morni, is often referred to in the text as just the son of Morni, even though he has brothers, kind of the same way that the brother of Jared is known in the Book of Mormon as just the brother of Jared. All the Morni are fierce and noble warriors. A crucial plot point is that Fingal's father is slain by Morni's sword. This sword of Morni, having been forged by ancient Luno, has been passed down from father to son for generations before Morni inherited it. Rumor has it that it was wielded by the legendary Strumon. At one point, Morni is buried with it, but later Gaul needs it, so he takes it from Morni's tomb, with Morni appearing as a ghost to give Gaul his blessing. But ultimately, it becomes Fingal's sword after he reduces the armies of Morni. Before the end, however, Gaul joins with Fingal and Cathmor to fight a common enemy. Amazingly, Gaul, like Ajax in the Iliad, and Fingal become the best of friends, uniting their peoples. In the end, Fingal hangs the sword of Morni on the sacred walls of Timora and vows to not use it except in times of greatest danger. It is like the sword of Laban in the Book of Mormon that appears in battles for 1,000 years, but in the end gets hung unsheathed on the walls of Cumorah. I think it quite probable that Captain Moroni in the Book of Mormon is based on Macpherson's Morni. It is possible that Spalding changed Morni to Moroni himself, perhaps to disguise it a little bit by adding the letter O. It is also possible that Spalding put it in as Morni and that Smith changed it to Moroni later for his own reasons. Moruth is spelled 2 ways with 1 and 2 R's. They each mean great stream or river. This stream flows out of Morven, which means great peaks. The suffix ben is presented as an older form of ben, B-E-N-N, which means peaks. Morven is also the name of the entire kingdom of Fingal, peaks, hills, and plains. Many chiefs and kings of the bloodthirsty clans live like bandits in the caves of Morven. Countless battles take place in the land of Morven. Northmore means great strength. Now, the text doesn't say explicitly, but experts suggest that Rathmore probably means great fort, since Rath in Gaelic means fort, enclosure, or dwelling place. Whether it does or not, it was the name applied to the chief of Clutha, who has 2 famous sons, Calthon and Colmar. Slimora evidently also means great hill, but in the text, it is not grassy, mossy, jagged, or rocky. Instead, it is highly wooded. If Joseph Smith had been into Macpherson, it would have been more fitting for him to have chosen Slimora for the name of the wooded hill in which he claimed to have found the place, but Spalding had in mind a rocky hill, so he chose Cumorah instead, which he probably spelled with an AH ending to make it seem more Hebraic for his well-established pattern. Later, it got ignorantly changed to Cumorah with a U through the Smith and scribe dictation only process. Timora is the Irish equivalent of Scotland's Morven. Etymologically, Timora can be broken down, according to Macpherson's semi-empirical, semi-whimsical lexicon, into 3 parts, t, mor, and r. Literally, these fragments translate to high great kings. More colloquially, however, Timora meant both High Mora and House of the Great King. Timora is also the name of the royal palace in Erin, another name for Ireland. Timora is the place where the chiefs and local kings come to hold council with the high kings, and where the land's most sacred artifacts, like scrolls and swords, are displayed and safeguarded. In Scotland's Morven and Ireland's Timora, there are chiefs, kings, and high kings. The high kings are often the fathers of lower, more local kings, which idea Spalding also incorporates into his Mormon story. Think of King Lamoni and his father, who was, quote, the king over all the land, Alma 18:9. The tragic successions of leadership in both Erin and Scotland are especially echoed in the power dynamics that Spalding puts into Jaredite successions in the Book of Ether. For example, the High King Cormac at one point is murdered by his bloodthirsty son Caerbar, and in the sacred halls of Temora no less, which creates outrage, unrest, and violence throughout the kingdom. In time, Oscar, the grandson of Fingal, challenges Caerbar on the battlefield, where they inflict mortal wounds onto each other. Cathmore, who is Caerbar's brother, reluctantly assumes the Irish throne and nobly prepares for war against Fingal's Scotland. None of this is very accurate historically, of course, but that didn't bother Macpherson, who preferred to elevate mythological elements, thus willfully portraying a bygone era as the most glorious. Stories that don't do that, Spalding tells us, are consigned to dust and to the moth. Both Spalding and Macpherson were on that same page while composing their revisionist and even anachronistic translations of fictitious ancient abridgments. Trenmore literally means strong great. He is Fingal's great-great-grandfather and the founder of the line of kings in both Ireland and Scotland, according to Macpherson. The suffix mon appears in these 4 words, always with the meaning of mountain. Lathmon means battle mountain. Dun means stronghold, so Dunlathmon means battle mountain stronghold. Lumon means bending hill or bending mountain. Strubon means mountain stream, which is also the name of a dynasty whose geocultural center is the mountain stream. Mormon, then, if Spalding was trying to perfectly emulate Macpherson, would mean great mountain. Punningly, he also meant it to mean great man, with mon coming from the Greek mon, meaning man of, in the same way that his own name, Solomon, meant man of shalom, or man of peace. Punning in Greek was a hallmark of wit and education among members of the Republic of Letters. A true gentleman is like a mountain, always a man of his word. Such a construction agrees with the description Spalding gives of Mormon in what is now Mormon 2:1. Quote, and notwithstanding I being young, was large in stature.
Okay. I know I'm throwing a lot of new information out there relatively
that's
quickly with
fascinating.
that. I apologize if it feels rushed, but I want you to get a sense of the kind of deep dive that I'm doing with these other sources and potential influences, either on Joseph Smith, which I don't think it was, or on people like Solomon Spalding. And
were these books at Dartmouth? Do we know that? Or were they just so pervasive? Everyone knew them. Thomas Jefferson, everyone was reading them, or...
They were. This was the biggest deal in Scottish and Irish history.
Okay.
And as you know, Spalding was English and Scottish in heritage, and Spalding is a traditional Scottish name. It's also an English name. But there are lots of other clues. I can't get into them now. When you go and you read the Fabius manuscript, and when you go and you read the Romance of Celeste, which I don't have time to talk about today, that show other influences from Macpherson's writing into things that were attributed to Solomon Spalding. And so when you add up all of those connections, it makes a very strong case, in my opinion. That's what I'm trying to do for you, that you'll read up from the book, and that you'll watch this other video and subscribe to my channel and try to help me find out how to make some of these connections that I think are very compelling. As far as I know, the general Mormon community, nobody knows that Cumorah means high rocky hill in Macpherson's book, having connected that to the Cumorah in the Book of Mormon. Now, there are a few people who made that connection, and even published it as like a footnote in Dialogue, the journal, in the 1970s, but it never got picked up by anybody, never went anywhere, because nobody actually read it. But I did. I sat down and I read the entire book, and I saw all these connections, and I was like, people need to know about this. It might be right. Parts of it are probably right. Parts of it are maybe your stretches, but we need real scholars to focus in on that. Right. People, and Dan Vogel is not a literary analysis. He has no degrees in anything relevant to that. He's a great historian, a great amateur historian. I'm an amateur. I wouldn't even call myself an amateur historian. I never have. But we need real professionals outside of us to actually look at these things, to read the works of Macpherson. And I've been in collaboration with a couple of statisticians who are doing word print analysis on the Book of Mormon and on Spalding and on Macpherson to see if there are phrases and terminologies that are being reused in a mathematically statistical enough way to say, yes, Spalding was influenced by Macpherson mathematically. And but that's going to be a peer-reviewed paper that's not going to come out until later this year or perhaps next year. But it's going through a process, and so I'm just letting you guys know about it. So there are people who are interested, but I want everyone to be interested in Macpherson. Was Joseph Smith into Macpherson? Did he read about Moroni and about all these words that start with more or have more in them or mon in them or like Camorra or Morni or whatever?
Yeah, that's kind of my question is how popular was this? You know, we've got
Very,
Spalding, but
very
then we
popular.
have Joseph Smith. Was it just in the literary soup of the day, one of the other things that we could see as an influence? How long was it popular before it was discredited?
Yeah. So it came out in 1761, the day that, not the day,
that's right. That's what you
year
said.
that Solomon Spalding was born. And it was really popular for about 20 years.
Okay.
And then in 1785, which is right when Spalding was at Dartmouth, that's when Samuel Johnson, who you saw, started saying, this is all wrong. This is correct. And it was in so many newspapers. All of the professors of linguistics were talking about it because, and you know, Professor John Smith at Dartmouth, this would be his wheelhouse. There are ancient documents that have fiction, but using proper nouns from the landforms, and maybe something like that is happening here in the United States, where the names of these tribes and the famous leaders, they're in the names, the Native American names of the rivers and the lakes and the Oneida and etc. And so they were looking for clues because they believed at Dartmouth that the Native Americans were an offshoot of the House of Israel, and they wanted to find linguistic and cultural evidence of that. And Dartmouth Smith taught Spalding, and he was one such person. He became a missionary for Dartmouth for 10 years, from 1785 to 1795. So this would have been very top of mind. There was no way that Spalding didn't know about this story. We know how widespread it was known, and it was so popular in the 1780s, but the controversy for the next 10 years between 1785 and 1795 was huge about whether or not this guy had completely made up an American Aeneid, right? A Homer's Iliad for Scotland and Ireland. Was it true or was it fabricated? And people believed it, and they had fights and debates, and there's newspaper articles and magazines all published throughout Europe where people were taking sides. And all of this died by about 1795 because it really became clear that it was a fraud. And so the idea that 25 years later, Joseph Smith was really super into Macpherson is kind of laughable. Joseph Smith was not a reader. He didn't go to school. He had maybe 2 years worth of very fragmented education scattered over many years. You know, some people try to say, oh, it might have been as much as 7 years. Only like 2 people out there think that. Most scholars say it's only 2 or 3 years in total, very fragmentedly, was Joseph Smith's education. He was not a reader. He wasn't very smart. He never impressed anybody. You know, for his whole life, every time he gave an interview, everyone always said that he was not educated, he was not well read, he wasn't impressive. What he could do with his charisma was to motivate crowds and convince him that he had special powers. That was his talent as a con artist.
It's true. He was an exhorter, and that is absolutely true. I was always really impressed with the letters that he wrote, though. I thought that doesn't track with everything else we know about him. I will say about Macpherson, it's too bad he didn't make his books into a religion. We would still be talking about them today. Right?
Yeah, I'm sure that was and these types of thoughts, like the one you just had, was probably what was going through Spalding's mind.
Yeah.
Like, I can do this. I can create an American version of this, and it'll have staying power. And because it'll, people want a deep hair, but I'll put clues into the fiction that only the most educated people will figure out. Nephi, Mormon, and a couple of other names, that Morni, and some others that I'll talk about later on in this presentation. But I think it's really exciting to understand how Macpherson may have been a source. If he was a source then you have to ask, or an influence. how does that modify your understanding how Spalding might have been involved, but also how does it change your or alter your thinking about how Smith might have used him as a source or an influence if you subscribe to the Smith sole authorship theory, which many people do.
So Lars, one
Yeah.
of my things I always like to look at is, to me, it's usually the simplest solution is the most likely solution.
Often, not always.
Not true. This seems to be kind of two steps back, when you got word endings from the Celtic being passed on to Solomon Spalding being used by Joseph Smith. So that would seem to be. I'm trying to figure out. I'm clearly, as I look at this more and all the times more is used in here, I can go, yeah, that's very interesting. But I can also look at scriptures where everybody's name is El, which means God in Hebrew, and it's man of God, man. And if more means great, then it doesn't surprise me that they'd use a lot great mountain, great river, great, and that you'd get that. So, what would you say to someone who says that it seems too complicated or too, for root endings in a book from 17 something being passed on to Joseph Smith, who only has 2 years of education or so?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest things that people always say and one reason why some people don't like the Spalding or Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory, or you could even throw the Spalding-Smith theory in there, that Smith got the text somehow from Spalding in a circuitous way that didn't involve Rigdon. All of these theories, one thing that people don't like is they say it needs to be super simple, and if it's not, I'm gonna discount it. I'm gonna put it off to the side, and I don't think that that's the right thing to do here. Quantum mechanics is a lot more complicated than Newtonian mechanics. And in many cases, obviously, Newtonian mechanics is the simpler explanation for things, but it can't explain everything. And there are some things, like the black body radiation problem, that can only be explained through quantum physics. And now we know that quantum physics is the only game in town. But for 100 years, people are like, enough with quantum physics. Einstein even said famously, God, who he didn't believe in, but God doesn't play with dice. Well, now everyone accepts quantum physics, and now we understand how Newtonian mechanics simplifies out of quantum mechanics when you do it on a statistical mechanical level. And it's almost like, yeah, we should have known that from the beginning. There is some complexity to the Spalding/Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory, but it's actually not that much complexity. And so people create a straw man out of that. Other people make the complexity argument errantly by making Joseph Smith more complex of a person than he could have been. As you hear theists all the time saying, oh, evolution and mutation and natural selection and all that time, that seems pretty complex to me. Simpler theory is God did it. Yeah, it sounds simpler, but it's not simpler. Why is it not simpler? Because now you've just posited a very complex being who is God. Where did he come from? There's a lot of complexity in God. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that people put the complexity wherever they're most comfortable putting it, and they chastise people for keeping complexity where they think it's most comfortable. People get hold of manuscripts, people steal manuscripts. Joseph Smith was a con artist. He could have inherited Spalding's manuscript through Rigdon, through someone. There are all kinds of explanations, and they're all natural explanations, and they're not actually that difficult. Some people have created parodies of it. Oh, and this person, and then a conspiracy, and Parley P. Pratt, and shoot that down. What I'm saying is that all of those natural explanations aren't actually complex. Joseph Smith got his hands on a text that he didn't write, however he got it. And we can argue until we're blue in the face about that. And unfortunately, there's not going to be a lot more historical evidence to come to light about this. So people are going to be stagnating on that particular issue. But when you look at the textual evidence that's in the Book of Mormon, which is what people haven't looked at the evidences of the Book of Mormon in light of Macpherson yet. There's a lot of new things to explore there. I think that Dan Vogel makes the mistake of making Joseph Smith more complex than it is, and he simultaneously makes the mistake of reducing the Book of Mormon to say, oh, anybody could have written it. It's just too simple. And that's not true either. But in the combination of those two over reductions creates a space for Dan to have his Smith sole authorship theory. But if you're honest about complexity, it's not a viable space. And so that's one of the cases that I feel like I'm making, and I'm asking him to clarify it with the new evidence that I'm presenting here. And I'm sure he will. I hope he'll do it in a respectful way. I doubt that he will, but we'll see. And that's all I can ask.
That's all you can ask. And that's all we can ask of people in the comments. What do you think about this? It's very interesting.
Yep. So is it okay for me to jump into the next thing?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, Macpherson loved Homer and Virgil, and it's clear that he was alluding and building on Homer and Virgil because he describes it a lot in the footnotes. And so I'm just giving you a couple of slides that have those footnotes carved out because he was a literary genius trying to be the Homer of his day for the Scottish and Irish people. And Solomon Spalding was doing the same thing. There have been plenty of articles written where people say, even Dan has mentioned this, that that there are elements of Homer and Virgil in the Book of Mormon that scholars have written scholarly articles about. And so to see that Macpherson was doing something similar and whoever wrote the Book of Mormon was doing something similar, I very much doubt that Joseph Smith just loved Homer and loved Virgil. I don't think so, but that's something else for us to talk about. So just wanting to show you these slides, and now to express that, okay, Virgil's Aeneid is Homeric fan fiction in which a worthy remnant of the house of Troy sails to a promised land, displaces the native peoples in what is now Italy, and ultimately unifies the Latins and the Etruscans under one new Roman identity. Likewise, Macpherson's Fingal and Timora together make one 2-volume epic story designed to create a shared heritage and history between the Irish and the Scottish by sensationalizing and enshrining into poetic literature the long-standing struggle and eventual reconciliation between the Celts and the Picts. I think that Spalding might have especially liked the juxtaposition of Gaul versus Fingal for another reason. Gaul, like you can see at the top of the screen, he was from a darker featured Duthno race, while Finn literally means fair, white, or blessed, depending on the context. So the story of Gaul and Fingal is not only pseudo-history, but also an allegory that reconciles an age-old struggle between two races, one of them supposedly lighter and more blessed than the other. My theory is that Spalding attempted to write his biblically inspired American Aeneid in the same allegorical spirit with which Macpherson wrote his, for lack of a better term, Gaelic Aeneid. And I think that Spalding loved the Native Americans that he had served as a Dartmouth missionary, and that he used his epic fiction to commentate on social issues like most fiction writers do, including his fear that white Americans would get prideful and sow the seeds of their own destruction at the hands of the darker races that they had been suppressing and even enslaving. And Spalding pulled naming patterns and even the more meaning great syllable because that's what sophisticated writers do. They allude to their favorite other writers. Spalding built on Macpherson's thematic foundation, yes, but then he adapted his name pattern approach to better suit his two linguistic goals. One, to tie his person and place names to the Bible rather than to Scotland and Ireland, and two, to tie them to regional landforms, especially rivers. This slide shows how Spalding consistently took modern rivers from the local environment, especially Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, all places where Spalding had lived, and from them constructed additional person and place names that would sound more ancient by phonologically changing them with linguistically defensible vowel and consonant shifts, just like Macpherson did. He does this with both the Fabius story on the top half of the slide and the Mormon story on the bottom half of the slide within manuscripts found. I go into a lot of depth on this in my part 1 video, but I'm just going to go through it relatively quickly here. But as a reminder, the Fabius story, if you'll remember from the Oberlin manuscript, that was written first, but it comes chronologically after the Mormon story, which starting around 400 AD, just as the Mormon story approaches its conclusion. I think that's really interesting that the Mormon story ends at around 400 AD, and that's when the Fabius story picks up. Just like how the Jaredite story kind of ends when the Mormon story gets picked up. So Spalding implies that the Delaware River in real life got its modern name from an ancient Hebrewish cognate, Delawah, the river Delawah, as it appears in the Fabius text, which Spalding permutes into Delawan when describing a land and Delawanax when describing a people. Notice how Spalding adds the suffix AH to make such names seem more biblical in their ultimate origin. For example, Adamah, Baalah, Jonah, Judah, and Zerah, like Zarahemla. Likewise, going back in time, the modern-day Susquehanna River becomes the river Susquehanna, which is also a land. The Ohio River becomes the river Owaho, which he turns into a land, a city, and a people with well-known forms of phonological drift, including H adding. This results in the morpheme ha, H-A-H, which Spalding uses in the Mormon story as well. Think of Ammonihah, Kumenihah, Moronihah, Nephihah, Zemnerihah, etc. The Genesee River in New York becomes the land of Geneseo and the king of Geneseo. Cattaraugus Creek, which is quite long in real life, is retroactively transformed into a land and also into the king of Cattaraugus. Notice how Spalding sometimes drops consonants or doubles them up when inventing new names from real-life ideas or creating altered ones from prior fictional names, the same way that Macpherson did. Spalding remakes the real-life Kentucky River into the more ancient River Kentuck, the land of Kentuck, the empire of Kentuck, the princes and king of Kentuck, and the people of Kentuck, which sometimes he calls the Kentuckans. The most important river in the Fabius story is arguably the Scioto River, which supposedly evolves into the Scioto River as it was spelled on maps during Spalding's lifetime. In the Fabius story, the Sciotan people are somewhat lighter skinned and more civilized compared to the darker, more warlike Kentucks who lived to the south. Again, quite reminiscent of Macpherson and what Spalding does in the Mormon story. Spalding continues this pattern in his Mormon story because he is going further back in time. As he's going further back in time, he phonologically drifts words like Sidon into the more Hebraic Sidon, which of course is the name of an ancient Phoenician city. Biblically speaking, Sidon was also the firstborn son of Canaan, who was a son of Ham, who was supposedly cursed with dark skin, thereby making Sidon a great-grandson of Noah. So the river Sidon, dividing another dark-skinned people from a lighter-skinned people, who all descended from the same family ultimately, was Spalding being clever with names and bodies of water, consistent with his great pattern and purpose, like what Macpherson did with Moruth, the great river, which separated people of lighter and darker skin. Sidon with an M is also a hill. Observe that N softening to M is a common phonological shift that seems to lend some authenticity to the naming system. Again, that's Spalding being clever. Smith wasn't this clever. He wasn't this educated. And I know people are always going to argue about that, but that's my position. Beyond being a biblical tie-in, Sidon serves to phonologically connect Mormon's River Sidon to Fabius's Scioto River because Spalding knew that rivers, like the Nile, central to any culture, were places where linguistic roots, but not necessarily suffixes, were more likely to be preserved and therefore more likely to be discovered, as Dartmouth missionaries, like Solomon Spalding, had speculated they might. This, as we know, had been the obsessive belief of Eleazar Wheelock, Dartmouth's first president, who hired men like Professor John Smith, in part, to find linguistic evidence that might connect the Native Americans to the Bible as a scattered branch of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Spalding does the same thing, this whole pattern that he has in the Fabius story, with taking names from the local landforms, altering them to make them seem more Hebrew-ish, and then putting them in his story. He is going to do that many times also in the Mormon story within Manuscript found, starting with the Lehigh River, which he probably saw on a map and then decided to consult his Bible dictionary. Finding Lehigh to be a part of Ramoth Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill, he might have thought, nice, I'll use Lehigh as a character. And since Ramoth is so similar to Ramah, the name of another Native American of a tribe that had received Dartmouth missionaries, I'll use Ramah as the name of a hill in my story, which is nice because Ramah appears in the Bible with and without an H. Spalding also turned Lehi into a land and a people in the form of the Lehi Nephis and the anti-Nephi Lehis, respectively. Then Spalding seems to have thought about the Oneida tribe, to where Dartmouth missionaries were also sent, among whom Spalding had also lived, looked at his map, and saw the Oneida River, which connects Lake Oneida to the Seneca River in Upper New York, not far from where Spalding had lived in Cherry Valley for many years. So Spalding took Oneida, disguised the dead giveaway EI diphthong, and slapped on the same Hebrewish AH ending that he had applied to Delaware, Susquehanna, Oahu, yielding Oneida, Onidah, which, like Ramah, Ramah, is also a hill in the Mormon story, as well as a city. So now, like Macpherson, as we saw, he makes up new names for multiple hills from different sources, and that lends some authenticity to the story. He's doing the same thing. If you don't know, a ripple is a noisy, shallow stretch of rough water in a stream. Not surprisingly, Spalding also worked this word into his river-based naming scheme. In the same literary style of Macpherson, Spalding breaks down the pretended etymology of Ripliancum in the text itself, just like we saw with those footnotes, right? In Ether 15:8, it says that the waters of Ripliancum are so called because Ripliancum, quote, by interpretation is large or to exceed all, meaning large ripples or ripples to exceed all. He does something similar with Iriantum. The text says in 1 Nephi 17:3 that Iriantum, quote, being interpreted means many waters. Here, the prefix ir, IRR, like the prefix ripple, is a water-derived morpheme. In this case, conspicuously coming from irrigation, which obviously has to do with water. I love that we can get these little glimpses into Spalding's playful personality by simply analyzing the proper nouns that he, not Smith, constructed. So, Spalding produced Iriantum from irrigation and Ripliancum from ripples. Now, I'm the first person, I've looked into this everywhere. No one has posited this as like an explanation for where Iriantum or Ripliancum come from, but it's consistent. The ancum, antum ending, meaning large or many or to exceed or big, right? And ear being a water-derived morpheme and ripple coming from ripples. I think that's probably the best explanation that anyone's going to ever get for those two words. Did Smith come up with that? Was he being clever? Why did Smith do that? Or did someone who was a little bit more educated in linguistics do that? And that's my contention that Spalding did. Incidentally, there is a lake in the region called Ripple Lake, which may or may not have been an influence. Keen to tie in these names to the Bible, it would seem that Spalding once again consulted his Bible dictionary. In it, he saw that Riblah was a village near the Sea of Galilee and a hill near the Arantis River. So, with some justifiable phonological drift, he turns Riblah into Riplah because P's and B's are closely related plosives. So you see that Spalding, like Macpherson, is morphing these words, taking things from the environment, trying to make them sound more ancient, trying to make them tied to the Bible where he can, and then in a phonologically justifiable way. There is linguistic cleverness in it. In my opinion, there is no doubt that these two stories, the Fabius story on top and the Mormon story on the bottom, and there's more, came from the same linguistic mind. That mind, I contend, had been educated at Dartmouth College under Professor John Smith, who was, by all accounts, a great linguist for his time, and whose title was Professor of Oriental Languages. He's the guy who would have known about Kircher's Nephi. And so there is the connection for how Spalding would have been inspired to use Nephi as a name for one of his fictitious characters, because he's writing fiction, but he wants it to sound real, but he also wants to do what all fiction writers do and add fun, add Easter eggs, add some things that reveal to the educated what's really going on. Joseph Smith, at the tender age of 22, was totally ignorant of this and all such linguistics, even if we were to grant him the 7 fragmented years of low-quality education that Mr. Vogel, quite frankly, more than struggles to justify. Recognizing how extensively Smith had roamed the countryside looking for new peepstones and buried treasure for several years instead of going to school, most scholars, like I said before, give Smith no more than 2 or 3 years worth of stop-and-go, low-quality pre-college education, which is also my opinion. And I'm not throwing William Davis under the bus. I will talk about him in other videos. You know, I like what his analysis. I think that there are some things that need to be investigated to refine that analysis. I think he's a wonderful individual. I'm not throwing him under the bus, but I do think that it's undeniable that he's an outlier in saying that Smith had 7 years worth of education. My position that Smith did not have anything near enough to compose significant fiction, certainly not enough to incorporate allusions to Homer, Virgil, and Macpherson, and to play so adeptly with phraseology from the Bible. You kind of have to go to Dartmouth, and you kind of have to be a Dartmouth missionary for 10 years to be so skillful with how you just randomly term phrases from the Bible scattered throughout the Book of Mormon. The next character name in this impressive and consistent pattern, linking the Fabius story on top to the Mormon story on the bottom through Bible-sounding rivers of water, is Kishkumen, which is potentially influenced by the modern-day Kishkumenetis River. Kishkumen, as we all know, is the founder of the band of Kishkumen, which after he dies becomes the infamous Gadianton robbers, with Gadianton being the successor of Kishkumen. So here I'm going to show another clip from the video that I put out recently.
In a small river located about 36 miles northeast of Pittsburgh with the Native American name of Kishkumenitas influenced the Book of Mormon name Kishkumen. This is very doubtful. Kishkumen first appears in Helam 1 verse 9. But prior to this, in verse 3 appears Pekumenai, which appears nowhere else in the Book of Mormon. Before this, Kumenai appears in Alma 56:14. So it could be argued that Joseph Smith was inspired by Kumenai and Pekumenai when he invented the name Kishkumen.
Let me quickly interject here that Spalding building his way to Kishkumen from Kumenai and through Pekumenai is far more supported than Smith doing so, if that's what actually happened, and I don't think that it was. Spalding's method for permutating prefixes, roots, and suffixes is consistent throughout the Fabius story, the Book of Mormon, and even the Romance of Celeste, though admittedly there are far fewer proper nouns in that ecstatic journey through the heavens. The patterns stand in Spalding's favor, which I have clearly demonstrated just in the context of rivers. On the other hand, when Smith makes up proper names in the Book of Abraham and in the Book of Moses, he does a deplorably bad, if not laughably sad job of it, as we shall see. That said, a different direction of thought for Spalding's Kishkumen is even better, in my opinion. But first, notice how Mr. Vogel tries to imply that the Kumen part of Kishkumen must have come from Pekumenai because Pekumenai appears before and nowhere else in the Book of Mormon. Such reasoning reflects a common sole authorship belief that Smith was both orally composing and orally dictating in real time over 60 working days, making up variations of proper nouns as he went along. There are other sole authorship sub-theories in which Smith composed slowly over multiple years, either purely in his head or perhaps with writing some things down long before he started dictating. Both of these mechanisms fail on several tests, but especially regarding word cluster patterns, which, as will become clear, must have been devised by Spalding. Nevertheless, for some reason, Mr. Vogel neglects the fact that Kumen with a K and Kumenonhai, also with a K, which are clearly more tightly tied to Kishkumen than Pekumenai, both exist in the Book of Mormon, each appearing in 3 Nephi 19, which is after Helaman 1, thus undermining whatever value Mr. Vogel tried to put to Pekumenai appearing nowhere else in the Book of Mormon. But let's hear out the rest of Mr. Vogel's complaint.
But Nielsen's suggestion is seriously flawed because he has misspelled the name of the river to match the Book of Mormon better. A search in Google Books using Nielsen's spelling turns up 0 sources. It is actually the Kishkumenetas River. Using various online pronunciations, this is how it really sounds.
Kishkumenetas. 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 Kishkumenetas.
Obviously, that sounds nothing like Kishkumen. What at first looked like a promising parallel has pretty much vanished.
Unfortunately, it is Mr. Vogel's analysis that is seriously flawed. I did not hide the spelling of the modern name, nor did I alter it to suggest a better match with the Book of Mormon person name. The older name does appear in Google Books exactly as I and Spalding had spelled it. Here is the relevant sentence from my book. Quote, "Kishkumen is the Today, the latter of the two bodies of water is spelled Kishkumen. However, in 1770 and throughout Spalding's lifetime, it was spelled Kishkumen. As you can see, I provided a reference, number 232, which most conspicuously contains an active blue hyperlink to A History of the Indian Villages and Place Names in Pennsylvania. Notice how my spelling exactly matches what that reference reports in Google Books for Skoll's 1770 map. Notice also how the SH phoneme was present in the 1755 map and the 1776 map. Here are some of the actual maps, each showing Kishka, K-I-S-H-K-E. It took over 100 years for the older spelling to linguistically drift from Kishka to Kiski. Moreover, vowel shifting between K, K short E, K, K short I, and K, K short U, through the schwa sound, is very common, with populations and even individuals comfortably using K, K, and K interchangeably. And that's not wishful thinking on my part. We know that K in Kishkumen with a short E was closer to K with a short U in 1770 because the adjacent tributary is Kishkushus, K-I-S-H-K-U. We also know that the mun in Kishkumen through the schwa might have been closer to man in 1770 because of how it is spelled here, clearly with Kishkumen, M-A-N. No one should be persuaded by Mr. Vogel's presentation of two doubly repeated computer-generated pronunciations of a modern spelling, nor should any Mormon or post-Mormon just assume that their modern pronunciation for Kishkumen could not have changed from the way that its inventor had intended over 200 years ago. The correlated pronunciation of Kishkumen as Kishkumen with a shifted stress onto the second syllable in the official Book of Mormon pronunciation guide is not authoritative. It got rather arbitrarily correlated in 1903. By way of history, President Joseph F. Smith formed a small committee and rather hastily told his men to standardize the pronunciation of all the names in the Book of Mormon by the next day. Some were not optimistic that it could be done. Miraculously, or perhaps not miraculously, quote, by the next afternoon, recommendations from the pronunciation committee were made by Elder Penrose, who submitted, inner quote, uniform arbitrary rules, close inner quote, which the committee had formulated and which have basically been retained. 1, words of 2 syllables should be accented on the first syllable. 2, words of 3 syllables should be accented on the second syllable, close quote, with these exceptions. Kishkumen was not on the exceptions list, and that is how Kishkumen changed into something that, quote,
sounds nothing like Kishkumen. What at first looked like a promising parallel has pretty much
no. What at first looked like a promising parallel has stayed a promising parallel.
All right, so that's just a clip where I'm trying to help people understand the level of rigor that I'm trying to bring to this and the kind of apologetic rebuttals that we're getting from Dan Vogel. He says that that my sources are not anywhere in Google Books, but in my book, I showed the sources were in Google Books. I provided hyperlinks. You can click on them, and when you go to them, you can see that I was telling the truth, that I didn't hide the name of the spelling so as to, deceive anyone. The spelling that I gave in the book exactly matches the spelling that it is today, and the spelling, the older spelling that existed before the modern spelling, which I did show was the modern spelling in the book, did exist during Spalding's day and for 100 years before that. If he wants to do the deep dive and start looking at maps for the 50 to 100 years before that, which he hasn't done. So he accuses me of not doing good scholarship and not doing proper documentation, where if he just spent 5 minutes and fact checked himself, if he actually clicked on the footnotes that were in my book and looked them up, he would see that I was telling the truth. But he knows that. He knows that I spelled Kishkumen, Kishkumenitas both ways in the book, and he knows that it was present in Google Books. So why doesn't he act more scholarly and less apologetic? To me, that says something. Maybe it's just that he's tired and that he's annoyed that I'm, bringing these things up. But that is a lack of good scholarship on his part. That is if I really am that bad of a scholar, then that's the pot calling the kettle black, and I'm calling him out on it.
All I can say is there's a lot of footnotes in Mormonism and post-Mormonism.
That's true. Yeah.
I have a hard enough time telling creek from crick. To me, it's crick. So
That's right. That's right.
And milk and pillow
And milk
pillow
and
like,
milk and
it's okay. It's okay.
it's okay.
I was a little entertained by Mr. Vogel's tone of voice when he implied that we shouldn't be willing to even entertain clues that are, quote, 36 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, presumably because it is so far away from anything related to Joseph Smith. But this is precisely the marketplace in which Spalding planned on selling manuscripts found, and probably would have published it if he hadn't died in October of 1816. For those of you who don't know, before locks and dams were built, one could not reliably raft goods for the purpose of commerce up the Ohio River beyond this orange arrow on account of the increasingly unnavigable ripples. Rippleyancum, meaning large ripples or ripples to exceed all, is what today we would call an Easter egg that Spalding intentionally put into his manuscripts found, because at the time he was writing it, he was planning on distributing his book to customers in the greater Pittsburgh area. In other words, Spalding constructed some of his semi-local, semi-ancient names to appeal to his marketplace, which was the area, including the rivers near Pittsburgh, including Kishkumen.
So I guess we don't really care where Joseph Smith lived because this theory is based on that Spalding wrote this, so it's more where Spalding hung out, correct? And is this the area that Spalding was from?
Well, yes, yeah. Spalding lived in Pittsburgh for 3 years, from 1812 to 1815, early 1815. Then he moved to Washington County and then to Amity County, which is just a little south of Pittsburgh, but 10 miles, 15 miles, that kind of a thing, south of Pittsburgh. But he actually sold art prints in Pittsburgh during the War of 1812, while his wife sewed uniforms for the soldiers, and she did that in Pittsburgh. And then when Spalding moved to Washington and then Amity, where he could be more secluded and finish his writing, and he had some health problems with his lungs, and he was trying to get away from the pollution of the city. His wife stayed there for those couple of years, but he would visit like every month, go back up to Pittsburgh. So this is Spalding's area. This is where he lived. So to get names of inspiration, Rippleyancum, Iriantum, Kishkumen from this region, for Dan Vogel knows that, and to say that, well, what does this area have anything to do? It has a lot to do with Spalding, and so do the other areas. The Oneida River, the Oneida tribe, that was not very far from Cherry Valley, where Spalding had lived. Spalding had also lived in Ashtabula County. He'd lived in, well, lots of places, all over New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And if he's trying to make a story where he's taking rivers from all over those regions, Cattaraugus Creek, Geneseo River, he alludes to those in the Fabius manuscript, the Lehigh River, the Susquehanna River, he refers to both of those throughout the manuscripts found. I think it's very clear that he has a pattern for how he's getting inspired to make proper nouns in his story, similar to Macpherson, and he's acting on it. Why is Spalding, or would Smith be picking these kinds of names from these places? It's just not a credible story. It's simpler to say Smith's sole authorship, and what is Occam's razor, the simple theory tends to be the better theory. Not when all the evidence is taken into consideration. All things being equal, you go with the simpler theory. But when you have evidence that discredits a simpler theory and evidence that supports a more complex theory, like quantum mechanics, you go with quantum mechanics. That's just the way it is. So, in sharp contrast on this topic, Palmyra was on the Erie Canal, which had no ripples at all. Certainly not since it was opened in 1825, 3 years before dictation with Martin Harris would begin. Of course, there were ripples along the Susquehanna River, and we have no reason to think that Smith wasn't smart enough to know or to have been exposed to the word ripples. So in other words, it is plausible that Smith could have constructed Rippleyancum and Iriantum, but it's more probable that Spalding did so, especially in light of this other pattern. So the following textual evidence from the Fabius story also makes it absolutely clear that this that you're seeing on your slide right now was indeed Spalding's chosen setting for manuscripts found. Oops, here it is.
At some point, not soon after Fabius's ship makes landfall, somewhere along the river Delaware, Fabius and his company travel up the Delaware as far as possible before heading straight west to the river Susquehanna, which they also follow along a westerly course almost to its headwaters in the Appalachian Mountains. According to the text, Fabius and company temporarily camp a few days' journey before crossing the peaks of Allegheny Ridge. Here they learn from the Delawans about the people who live on the other side of the mountain range and how it is their tradition that they emigrated from the westward. Consequently, their pursuing a westerly path would lead them to the land of the Delawans' nativity. Fabius then says, "We are also informed by some of the natives that at a distance of about 15 days' journey in a northwesterly course, there is a great river which runs in a southwesterly direction, and that along the banks of this river there are great towns and mighty kings and a people who live in a state of civilization."
Okay. So in that animation, we saw how Spalding geographically connected the Delaware, W-A-H, the Susquehanna, W-A-H, and Kishkumen's river, right here in blue, Kishkumen, in the plot of the Fabius story, as well as linguistically by manipulating the suffix of each one. So in other words, there is a pattern here. This is the setting of the Fabius story. And it's insomuch that the Mormon story is the story of the ancestors of the Fabius story, of the people in the Fabius story, then it totally makes sense that this area would be influential on Spalding while conceiving of proper nouns in the Mormon story, including Kishkumen. So all of this is to say, it is not far-fetched at all that Spalding would have drawn on Kishkumen like these other names, Hebraized them, bibliized them, making them sound more ancient and putting them as inspiration for his story the same way that Macpherson did. So Fabius, sorry, I have to make sure I'm on the right spot. There you go. Fabius even says that they had to be careful as they traveled, there we go, along the great river, lest they should fall into the hands of robbers. This is what he says in the Fabius story. These robbers, Fabius says, who live along these rivers and hide in the mountains above, later turn out to be, quote, the most ferocious band of murderers that ever disgraced humanity, which is a perfect description of the band of Kishkumen in Spalding's Mormon story, and that, of course, later became the Gadianton robbers. Fabius also narrates that the Delawans had found records from this more ancient people, which were written right to left and top to bottom, and contained diacritical marks to show, quote, variation of case, mood, and tense. As I'm sure most of us know, Masoretic Hebrew is written right to left and top to bottom and has diacritical marks. In this same paragraph, Fabius discusses how writing originated from Egypt or Chaldea. Also in that same paragraph, Fabius says, "At present, I shall waive the account of its introduction," implying that he would later discuss the Egyptian-like, Hebrew-like record that had been found and then later presented to Fabius. Such foreshadowing sets up the next story in his manuscripts found, which is the Mormon story. Spalding uses similar foreshadowing when the Jaredite plates are brought to the Nephites, and there again, the Jaredite story is introduced, but then not told until much later. So Spalding is using the same device to connect his layers of his stories together in a string of manuscripts found. In case you're wondering how Kish might tie to the Bible, consider that in the book of Judges, there is a story about an ancient river, the river Kishon, that changes its course and sweeps away the bad guys, which I discuss in greater depth in my part 1 video. It is not at all surprising then that Spalding would merge two river-inspired / Bible-inspired morphemes, Ripple and Kish, to make Ripple Kish in the Mormon story. Here is what I consider to be a better linguistic tree for Kishkumen than what Mr. Vogel has championed.
Consistent with his prior pattern, Spalding found a type of the ancient Kishon River in his nearby Kishkumenitas River, from which, through the schwa sound, he derived Kishkumen by taking off the Native American ending. Looking for building blocks on which to create names, he then decomposed Kishkumen into Kish and Kumen. Kish he made into a prefix, a full name, and a suffix. See Akish and Riplikish. Incidentally, I think that Spalding imagined Kish to mean evil, as if it were an inversion of the biblical Kishon. Recall that Riplikish in the Jaredite story is also evil, as his name might suggest. It is a combination of Ripple and Kish. Swapping the syllables in Kuman, he generates Ankum with the appropriate vowel and consonant shifts that one would expect to see while moving a character back in time by a millennium or two. He puts cum as both cum and kum in his toolbox as a prefix, middle syllable, and suffix, as evidenced by these words. Note especially Moriankumer, Tiankum, and Ripliankum. The jump to kumen on high from kumen is obvious. Spalding loves to use on and high as suffixes, even together. I'll explain later from whence probably cometh more, mur, and ta. If you study these matters carefully, I think you'll quite agree that Joseph Smith did not permute Book of Mormon names during a one-take, straight-through, 60-day composition dictation process. I think you'll also agree that Smith did not compose the proper nouns nor create the plot. No, Spalding constructed a bank of prefixes, roots, and suffixes drawing from literature that he wanted to emulate, from the Bible, and from the local environment, including rivers. Then he played around with them the way that Macpherson did. When Spalding sat down to compose manuscripts found, he seems to have written an overall outline first, and then sprinkled in his newly named characters throughout with a scattered pattern and some phonological drift to make it seem more authentic.
Okay. In a moment, I will show you a mind map of the proper nouns that I constructed, showing the similarities between the Fabius story and the Mormon story. But here I wanted to take a quick pause and see if either of you had any thoughts that you wanted to share on any of that so far.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself. I don't know what happened. My
okay.
dogs were growling and sleeping. So, it's funny because I think about being a kid and reading the Book of Mormon, and the names were so fascinating to me always. They were fun to say. They were very interesting. Of course, I never thought of where they came from or what their influences might have been. I never even thought of that when I was in college and I was in an upper division Latin class and I was translating, the Iliad and the Aeneid back and forth. Fascinated by names and things like that, but never made a connection to the Book of Mormon. But yeah, it's interesting. It is very interesting. What do you think, Landon?
I was interested by the AH names, and I thought that was pretty fascinating to see. I could certainly see where that would be a tie, or where
yes, and that Spalding is using that pattern in the Fabius story and in the Mormon story very consistently, many times, and that a lot of these are river-based. That's an interesting tie-in, that he's pulling it from his local landforms. And I think, I have an entire chapter that's dedicated to the patterns that I see in the book, which Vogel in his response said that he reduced. Well, I'll get into it later, but he basically says one sentence about all of that work, and he mischaracterizes it, which I'll get into with a clip later on. But I do think that Mormons and post-Mormons alike, and including people like Dan Vogel, they don't put any real time into understanding where are these names coming from. No one put enough time into Nephi to find. I'm the first guy in the history of Mormonism and post-Mormonism, except for people like Nibley who were hiding it, that Nephi was a real person name and that Mormon was a real person name that existed historically outside of the Book of Mormon. And then Iriantum and Ripliankum and I've got some more later on in the presentation. I think that everybody needs to just study this a lot more. I'm not a linguist, but I am seeing linguistic patterns from Homer, from Virgil, and from Macpherson. And I think professionals will find a lot more. And the professionals might say, "Oh, a few of your connections here, Lars, are tenuous," and that's fine. I'm not a professional, but I think that we will find more if people take it seriously. And that's what I'm asking everyone in the sound of this podcast to please do.
Right. And again, that's what's so interesting, I think, to Mormonish, to Landon, and to myself, is that the name, Abba Nephi and Mon More, regardless what anyone thinks of that, there was interest enough at BYU to try to really keep that on the down low, to make that disappear, to perhaps gather up sources from other universities, and that's what's interesting.
Not give them back.
Whether or not it's real or not, I feel like church leadership, BYU, was concerned enough about it that they were taking steps, and those things we have information on. So, and the fact that they're concerned about it, what does that tell you? They
Yes.
question themselves, the
Yep.
origin. So what do you think, Landon, along those lines? It just kind of all ties into that to me, that BYU angle, regardless of what anyone really thinks about the different authorship theories.
One of those things that I talked about earlier is, in this email from this person that related this to us, he mentions 2 BYU staff members. He says they both related that Dartmouth had filed complaints against BYU for not returning materials, that the fines for losing in quotes, not returning the materials were huge, like millions of dollars, and the matter was being handled by church lawyers. The rumor was that a certain person was leveraging his influence with First Presidency and Q12 to pull out of circulation everything they could obtain on Monmore and Kircher in order to squash and discredit anyone working on the Solomon Spalding manuscript theory.
Yeah.
He pointed out that because Kircher referenced Rabbi Nephi and that this and other citations could not be corroborated, supposedly in the inaccessible Vatican Library after all, they must therefore be fabricated and thereby discredit Kircher and everything else tied to the Solomon Spalding manuscript theory. It was brilliant, but also pure evil, because the fact remains the Book of Mormon contains the names of Mormon and Nephi, which calls into question the legitimacy of Book of Mormon exegesis as told by the so-called church. So
Hashtag open the vaults. We cannot trust BYU. We cannot trust Mormon historians, and we cannot trust several non-Mormon historians who are, employed by the Mormon History Association. That's where they're getting their funding. Most of that comes from the Mormon Church. They are not going to be forthcoming with this. We need to get it out into the hands of the public. We need people who are inside to be whistleblowers. We need them to get out and to put their life on the line, put their reputation on the line. And I've done it. My twin brother has done it. We're imperfect people, but we are trying to catalyze this so that the rest of Mormonism can get access to the truth about what happened. How was it covered up? Why was it covered up? How much of it was right versus in terms of the Smithsonian authorship theory? How much of it was right in terms of the Spalding Rigdon Smith theory? There's gray areas. There's things that need to be interpreted. We can't get to the bottom of this problem when people are still deliberately hiding information. And it's the post-Mormons who are complacent, who are allowing it to happen because they're not creating enough stink. They're not pushing hard enough. They're not making the journalists go out there. They're not, right? They're not pressuring their friend. And I know how hard it is to be half in, to have family members who are in, and to say, you know what, I still need to go public with this. I know something about what's going on inside and it needs to be told. And I was willing to do it. It's very, very hard to do it. It comes at a tremendous personal cost. But if you have information about this, do the right thing at long last and come out with it. If you're a retired BYU professor or even a current BYU professor, find ways of anonymizing things. Give it to the widow's mite, give it to Landon and Rebecca, give it to someone so that they can corroborate it and not hide it and not use apologetics anymore to distort the truth that we frankly deserve to know by now.
Yeah, and I feel that's what this person who reached out to us was doing, because they knew that I would recognize all the names from BYU from that era. And I did. I can corroborate that. They worked in the positions this person talked about, and they were doing the things this person mentioned. So again, whether this speaks to whether anything here is right or wrong, the point is some people at BYU and church leadership cared enough, were concerned enough to try to take steps to put this away. And that's very interesting. So you're right. I would love to know more about that.
That to
they
me,
were worried.
That tells me that the church itself isn't as bought in on the, the miraculous story of the Book of Mormon, the miraculous narrative that they believe, when Solomon Spalding theory became a big thing, they all of a sudden said, we better look into this and we better check it and we better start hiding the sources. Now, we
for 100 years they got away with that.
Yeah, they did. And if you pay attention to what this person is telling us, they borrowed sources from other universities and kept them and willingly paid the fines at a time where the church was not wealthy. So that tells me perhaps it was a priority to try to, keep this under wraps. And there was a point in what this person was telling me that BYU was being censured in their interlibrary loan program as far as not being able to borrow from other libraries. Now, I've looked into that. I've tried to contact the ALA. I would love to hear anecdotally from any students at that time if they tried to use interlibrary loan and were told they could not, because as I understand it, there was a censure that was in place until they were able to deal with it. And this person told us, it was church lawyers that were helping with that. Just, we'll pay the fine, we'll keep the materials. We don't know where they are, or not we'll keep them, but we don't know where they are. So I feel like that's a provable thing. Was BYU in that era, in the 80s, was there some point where there was such a censure on them that people were not able to use interlibrary loan? So if anyone out there was in that department or knows anything or can even anonymously say anything, that's a verifiable fact. And that could show that, yes, they were concerned enough about these materials, regardless of the path of where these materials would learn, that they would lead, they were willing to get rid of them. So I don't know, interesting.
Very interesting. And especially as touching Dartmouth, I'm sure that the church settled whatever lawsuits. And so that would be accompanied by some kind of non-disclosure.
I know I had someone look in. I have a Dartmouth researcher and we went through it a lot and they said the records were too old. Nobody could tell if that had happened. But I still find that really surprising too, because that would have been a big deal. That amount of money back in that era and a university not returning materials all on the same topic. I just feel there's somewhere, some information is out there somewhere, and maybe someday it'll come to light, but pretty fascinating.
Real journalists who have credentials, who have access,
exactly,
who know how to manipulate the Freedom of Information Act. Like, please start digging. We really need this.
I think so too.
So here I'm going to now move on to another clip where I'm going to compare proper name construction within Spalding's Fabius story and in the Mormon story, and you'll see that there are even more similarities, some of which have never been published anywhere else. And I think that they also speak volumes. So let's go to that.
On the left side of this slide are names from the Fabius story. On the right-hand side are names from the Mormon story. The largest cluster of names in the Book of Mormon starts with Am. Similarly, the largest cluster of names in the Fabius story starts with the Hebrew root Ham, which brings to mind the morphing of Abram to Abraham, as well as the skin-darkening biblical curse of Ham, as it was believed in Spalding's day. In my book, I discussed how Spalding may have employed H-dropping, or H-adding, depending on how you look at it, intentionally, as it was a controversial linguistic topic in his day. Spalding evolves his names with consistency on both sides of the line. On the right, Am gets connected to Lamb, Ram, and Sam. On the left, Ham also connects to Lamb, Ram, and Sam. Lamb goes to Lem, and Ham goes to Hem. He adds suffixes. Laban goes to Laban Co. Incidentally, the sword of Laban and the sword of Laban Co. are major plot elements in both stories. On both sides, we've got names with C changing to K and CH changing to K or to CK. Name fragments are often compounded with others. Here at the top, Laman and Enoch make Lamech with a CH. Incidentally, Spalding probably wanted Laman to be pronounced Laman, but we don't have to go into that here. Lamech drifts into three closely related versions, Lamech, Lamech, and Lamach. Not surprisingly, Laban Co. and Lamech fuse into Labamach, which forms a group with Labaska, Lobaska, and Baska. Similarly, Ammon and Moron fuse into Amaron, which has its own permutations. For example, Amaron with an A and Amaron with only one M, which forms a group with Ammonite, Ammoniha, and Ammoniahite. On the left, Ham goes to Gam, and on the right, Am goes to Gad. Gad forms its own cluster, and then, perhaps with the biblical Gilead coming to mind, he generates a Gid cluster. As if such fecundity were not enough, the two come together to make a cute little baby Gigah cluster. One can easily see Spalding thinking about featuring Gilgah and Gilgash as a deliberate hat tip to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
And I'm actually going to quickly pause right there and say that I was wrong about that last part. Spalding died in 1816 before the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered. So I just want to publicly thank the two people who emailed me about that. Like I said last year here on Mormonish, I fully accept that I'm going to make some mistakes from time to time, and I love that you're going to engage and set me right on those things. Not all parallels are parallels, and we all knew that that was going to happen going into it. So thank you for that, and I want to express that I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong.
Contrasts the right side triad, Gadianton, Corianton, and Morianton, with Hambach, Kelsock, and Rambach. Notice how Spalding intentionally pulls names from the Bible into his clusters. For example, Enoch, Laban, Ammon, Rama, Sam, Gideon, and Nimrod. But now notice how Nimrod conspicuously maps to Moonrod and Lacunrod on the Fabius story side of the line. By the way, Lacunrod is a high priest who chastises Elsion for allowing, quote, the priesthood to have too much influence in the court of Rambach, close quote. Speaking of Elsion, there is a plethora of ons going on both sides. On the left, we have Nemapon, Ohan, Elsion, Helion, Helicon, and Lamon with a silent B. On the right, we have Ammon, Amulon, Amaron, Moron, Mormon, Morianton, Corianton, Gadianton, and Gideon. Such suffixes work for Spalding because they are Semitic, Roman, and biblical. Think of Sidon and Zion, for example.
Okay, so those two slides notwithstanding, Mr. Vogel doesn't see any consistent naming patterns at all between the Fabius story and the Mormon story. Speaking of my linguistic analysis, Mr. Vogel says,
He spends pages playing with names in the Book of Mormon and Spalding's writings, manipulating the syllables and dropping letters, attempting to show a relationship, but I found this utterly unconvincing.
well, Mr. Vogel, of course, is entitled to his opinion, but that does not excuse the impropriety of reducing my chapter on Spalding's consistent and creative namings with rivers and prefixes and suffixes across both the Fabius story and the Mormon story, and of course across, my stuff with Macpherson stuff, to this one intentionally poorly constructed diagram. I can't think of a better example of someone knowing what the straw man fallacy is, and then voluntarily making his own straw man depiction. No true scholar represents someone else's work this way. I said it, and I believe it. Mr. Vogel can dismiss my proper noun analysis between the Fabius story and the Mormon story all he wants, but that doesn't mean that you should. Calling it an extended name game online is cute. However, it is not a good reason to dismiss textual evidence that he doesn't like or that doesn't really support his Smith sole authorship theory. And there's more evidence. For example, someone came up with the idea of evolving Coriantum into Coriantumer and Moriantum into Moriancumer. Was that person Solomon Spalding or Joseph Smith? What was going through that person's mind? And could he have been influenced by something specific? In the background of this slide, you will recognize the mind map that I presented earlier showing Macpherson's linguistic groupings. In the foreground, I've included a sketch of his fictitious bloodline for the ancient Irish and Scottish kings. Notice how Conar, using the translation key in the lower left-hand corner, would mean big warrior, with AR being an augmentive suffix. Conan, in contrast, would mean little warrior or son of a warrior, with AN being a diminutive suffix. For Macpherson, attaching more to the end of an already augmented name, as it turns out, conveys a special title. So Conar More literally means Conar the Great. Purely for fun, it would seem, Solomon Spalding, with his very Scottish name, may have mimicked this pattern in his Mormon story, which of course eventually became the Book of Mormon. Coriantum becomes Coriantumer, like Coriantum the Great. Moriantum becomes Moriancumer, Moriancum the Great. If this is the true etymology of Coriantumer and Moriancumer, we must ask ourselves just how likely it might have been that Joseph Smith got the idea of using more as both a suffix and a title, as if he had ravenously studied Macpherson while conducting his money-digging long cons, but he didn't. Mr. Vogel prefers to ignore such observations, chalking them up to coincidence. To him, Carmora meaning high rocky hill and having that same pronunciation, Carmora, is just a coincidence. Nephi, being Athanasius Kircher's infamous linguist, who supposedly knew how to translate an intermediate form of Egyptian is to him another coincidence. Mormon being the caricature of yet another infamous linguist from Kircher's same decade and Jesuit order, again, to Mr. Vogel, is just another coincidence. Kircher, Mormon the parasite, Monmore, as you were talking about earlier, and Macpherson were all infamous linguists who pretended to have ancient manuscripts and got caught in their lie. Spalding subtly alluding to them in his manuscripts found through the names of his characters is creative, consistent, and clever. Mr. Vogel's excuses for dismissing them are none of the above. Here is some more evidence that Mr. Vogel will undoubtedly find a reason to ignore. Near the end of the Book of Mormon, Spalding invents a character named Arantis, who, quote, has fallen by the sword. Of course, archi is a Greek root word meaning ancient, which in modern English is most conspicuous in the word archaeology, literally the study of ancient things. Antis comes from the Greek word anti, which means against, opposing, or opposite. Thus, archiantis, with a masculine singular and Latin ending, like Julius, Augustus, Fabius, and Severus, would playfully mean anti-archaeology. In other words, this man is not really an ancient person. That's what archiantis means. So to Spalding, archiantis serves as a subtle clue near the end of the book for those who hadn't picked up on the hundreds of other clues and anachronisms and linguistic patterns and tie-ins to Homer and Virgil and Macpherson, that his Mormon story, like the Bible, was not literally true ancient history. To Spalding, his stories are fan-fictional and figuratively true in the important sense that they can help us better understand culture, heritage, and the human condition. Spalding, as we know, was a fantasy writer and deep into the Romance movement, which was literally all about mashing up ideas and pushing the limits of traditional historical fiction. In both scope and purpose, Spalding situated his ancient American romance of the Bible somewhere between Virgil's Aeneid and Macpherson's Fingal and Timora. Under my K5 theory, there is no problem with archiantis meaning anti-archaeology. It's just a fun, albeit totally anachronistic, example of verbal irony for those educated enough and observant enough to pick up on the detail. We might even go so far as to call Solomon Spalding a pious fraud, in the sense that Spalding endeavored to write an authentic sounding Homeric history of ancient America that would pass muster with and even fool the average person while delighting the especially educated reader with some telltale signs like Nephi, Mormon, and Archiantis. Thus, like the author of the parables, Spalding deliberately wrote on more than one level because his audience was of mixed education. But how do we explain Archiantis under Mr. Vogel's sole authorship theory? Okay. On Gospel Tangents, Vogel defined his pious fraud characterization of Joseph Smith as follows. So this is quote, I'm trying to find as a non-believer now the most charitable view of Joseph Smith that a non-believer can have. Do you just think, oh, he's just lying and the whole thing's a fraud and he's just a con man trying to get money? That's what a lot of extreme critics of Joseph Smith say. He's trying to get money, power, and sex. And I, Dan Vogel, say, I don't believe that. I believe that he used deception to sell that he had a revelation. It's inspired, but he has to sell it to other people to make it hard for them to reject his revelation. To make it as hard for them to reject his revelation as possible, right? Because he learned how to do that as a treasure digger, and he's using this skill to build confidence to make people believe his revelations. So I, Dan Vogel, see Joseph Smith as an inspired pseudo-epigraphist, like the Assumption of Moses, like the Ascension of Isaiah and the Book of Enoch. These are pseudo-epigraphic works written by anonymous people trying to smuggle new doctrines into the Christian tradition by writing in the name of a dead prophet. These are writings that are supposedly lost and rediscovered. So I, Dan Vogel, believe Joseph was doing a similar thing with the Book of Mormon. He's writing pseudo-epigrapha, but he believes he's inspired. He knows there's no Lehi and Nephi and all that stuff, but he believes that this is the method of teaching true doctrine. He really believes that, and he's trying to correct false doctrine. He's combating the deists and the non-believers in his day. He's trying to shore up the Bible, which is being criticized by deists and the skeptics of his day because of problems that they see in the Bible or its incompleteness, and their sectarian strife over what the Bible says. He's trying to calm that down. He's trying to make people believe that otherwise may not believe, but he's also trying to garner for himself power to found a New Jerusalem government. Close quote. Okay, so that is Mr. Vogel's verbatim description of his pious fraud theory. Notice how I don't mischaracterize Mr. Vogel's theory when I talk about it to other people. I hope that in time Mr. Vogel will consider treating me the same way. But before analyzing Arantis under Vogel's pious fraud theory, I want to quickly give my reaction to it. First, I think that my Spalding, Rigdon, Smith authorship theory does a much better job of finding, as a non-believer now, the most charitable view of both Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith that a non-believer can have. Mr. Vogel has said publicly that any involvement of Sidney Rigdon in any way before 1830, with or without rewriting the lost 116 pages, must be a fraudulent, villainous conspiracy on Rigdon's part. And I say, I don't believe that. However, like Vogel, I also believe that Smith used deception to sell a book. Solomon Spalding, not Joseph Smith, was, quote, inspired to write his fictional Mormon story, in the same way that Homer was inspired to write the Iliad, and Macpherson was inspired to write Fingal and Tamora. Spalding, and probably not Smith, in 1828, was aware of the Assumption of Moses, the Ascension of Isaiah, and the Book of Enoch. It was Spalding who riffed on the pseudo-epigraphic projects that had tried to influence Christianity by making up his own dead prophets. Yes, such manuscripts were supposedly lost and then rediscovered, but it was Spalding, not Smith, who was doing something similar with manuscripts found, which eventually became the Book of Mormon. Technically, however, the Mormon story is not pseudo-epigrapha under any authorship theory. Both Richard Bushman and Dan Vogel are dead wrong about that. Pseudo-epigrapha involves, quote, falsely writing in the name of a previously known historical figure or character. Spalding's characters, like Nephi, Mormon, and Ether, however, were all brand new. Thus, Spalding's manuscripts found was more biblical fan fiction than it was pseudo-epigrapha. I really want to stress that point again. Spalding was not writing pseudo-epigrapha. He was writing pseudo-history. And that is a distinction with a difference that makes it harder to understand why the Smithsonian authorship theory has problems and why the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory can be improved, has been improved over what has been believed it was, 50 years ago. That said, some of the Isaiah stuff in 2nd Nephi and the altered teachings of Jesus Christ in 3rd Nephi do classify as small bits of pseudo-epigrapha inside of Spalding's much larger romance of the Bible. Spalding knew that there was no Lehi or Nephi and all that stuff. But knowing the impact and staying power that Homer and Virgil and Macpherson, Homer and Virgil had on societies for thousands of years, he honestly believed that epic fiction was a legitimate method for teaching true things, which it is.
I feel that's what the church is saying now about the Book of Mormon. A lot of people feel it's moving away from being historical and just saying we're teaching great lessons and there are wonderful allegories in here. And not the church itself, but I know individual faithful members, a lot of them are starting to feel that way because it's so problematic historically that you have to look at it this other way. So that's kind of interesting. What do you think, Landon?
No, I agree. That's the direction they have to go because it's clearly a 19th century production, and that's the thing about this is, people will look at this and say, "Oh God, look at these post-Mormons. They can't figure out how Joseph Smith did it because he clearly was inspired to do it, and it's clearly true. And that's not the case. Everyone
He's like,
can agree that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century production. The question is, how did he do it? And there's so many options out there, and there's strengths for Solomon Spalding. There's strengths for sole proprietorship. I mean, you can probably list 10 or 12 different theories or ways that he could have done it. And so it's just trying to get to the bottom of which one did he use to get there. But there's no doubt among almost anyone who doesn't believe this as a tenet of their faith, that it's clear the Book of Mormon's a 19th century production.
Absolutely. And so that it was intended to be written as fiction originally. And then it morphed into something more, because there was this dictation process where Smith had, well, I'll get to these slides later on. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We're getting more information. We're all agreeing that it was fiction. It was intended to be read as fiction. It should be read as fiction. And we really shouldn't go too much deeper with anything literal. Otherwise, you're going to lose your testimony. So we're getting there. And the details about who wrote that fiction, how did they write the fiction, what patterns what sources, what influences, what linguistic patterns did that person use? Are they similar to other things that people have written, like Spalding had written? I've shown that there are similarities. There are not similarities between the fictional arcs and narratives and name constructions versus other things that Joseph Smith was known to fabricate. We'll get into some of that later. We're getting there. It's going to take some time. It's messy, and you've got imperfect people like me who are trying to push the ball, and we need other people who are less imperfect to help push the ball. So don't leave it to me. Take it away from me, and do better with it than I can do. That's
well, the other thing with post-Mormon is you don't have paid full-time academics to prove your point. Everyone has to do it on their own voluntarily. Nobody gets paid, whereas the church has an army of people who are paid to try to defend these positions.
And whenever someone finds something interesting, they run it up the chain and they say, "Oh, that's been worked on in this other project, someone else," and it gets buried and it gets shut down, right? The bureaucracy is very good at hiding bodies, like that we know for sure. They kept the seer stone. It took 30 years of Mormons and semi-Mormons and post-Mormons and quasi-historians to put enough pressure. No, I've seen that rock. It's there. They're lying. There is a rock. They're telling you there's not a rock. There is a rock. Michael Quinn, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And eventually they have to out with it. And it's only because of that force on the periphery, putting pressure on Mormonism proper and on BYU to do the right thing academically. You do enough pressure, you do it for 30 years, then eventually they're going to put the seer stone in the magazine. And I think that 20 or 30 years from now, they're going to put a lot of stuff about Solomon Spalding and Parley P. Pratt and all of this linguistic analysis with Spalding and Nephi Mormon. They're going to finally be forced to come out with it. And then we're going to get closer to the truth. But I do think that we're half a lifetime away. Well. Anyways, after Spalding spent a decade of his life defending the Bible as a Dartmouth missionary and actively looking for ways to graft the Native Americans into the House of Israel, both linguistically and culturally, Spalding finally rejected organized religion as a whole and became something of an atheist and a deist, while viewing the Bible itself as epic fiction. When Spalding was finally ready to write his own epic fiction, then he chose to romanticize ancient American history with biblical hooks, again, to the Tower of Babel, to a long-lost son of King Zedekiah, and to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And seeing how desperately the Irish and the Scottish had clung to Macpherson's epic fiction, Spalding earnestly believed that he could tap into and do something similar in America. In sharp contrast, Joseph Smith was so credulous and uneducated at the tender age of 22, he was unable to see Spalding's manuscript for what it was, for the layered, intelligent, and epic fiction that it started out to be. He kind of bastardized it and with how he interacted with it, but that's what it originally started out to be. Consequently, he mistook the text for ancient American scripture, whether he had learned it from Sidney Rigdon or in some other way. We can argue until we're blue in the face. And Smith believed that a hill full of golden plates actually existed as mentioned in the manuscript, because Smith was gullible. Anybody said that there was gold in the mountain, he's like, yep, it's there and I can see it in my head, right? He believed things so credulously because of his non-critical upbringing in his household. At the beginning, Smith only wanted to find the plates that the text alluded to for the purpose of getting rich off the gold. But when he finally realized that he was never going to actually see the plates other than in his peepstone, or in other words, in his imagination, he needed a new way to make money off the manuscript without people thinking that he had stolen it or somehow acquired it. So in September 1827, he lied, saying that he now possessed the plates and that he would soon translate them. Of course, Smith could not very well turn into the printer a manuscript written in Spalding's or Rigdon's handwriting. He didn't want to do the work himself. Smith was not a hard worker. He never used a shovel when they went on his digs. And he didn't enjoy writing, and he didn't have good penmanship, so he didn't want to write it himself. So he enlisted someone else to do it in a very performative way. Consequently, Smith put on a very performative dictation, kind of an elaborate and convincing show for his well-conditioned scribes, thereby persuading them that the Mormon story was being revealed in real time, specifically so that they would not think that it had been written in English previously. As a well-experienced con man, the wool was not hard for Smith to pull over the eyes of his very uneducated and very gullible scribes. Martin Harris said that he saw Jesus in the form of a deer. I mean, these guys are super superstitious, very gullible, and very obedient and conditioned by Joseph Smith. And that's important. This is the true sense. Oops. Next slide. This is the true sense in which Joseph Smith was a pious fraud. In my opinion, Mr. Vogel gets it completely reversed. Smith did think that Lehi and Nephi were real. He truly believed that the golden plates and all that stuff existed in the physical world, even though he never found them. But as a slowly rehabilitating con man, he convinced others that the freshly dictated manuscript was new to the English language. Then, as quickly as he could, he didn't even care about the religious value of the book. As quickly as he could, he went and tried to sell the copyright in Canada. When that failed, Smith's revenue model switched from actual book sales, coercing Martin Harris in August 1829, months after the original manuscript had been completely dictated, to then put up his farm as collateral against the printing costs. When that news got out, a serious boycott ensued. Consequently, in late 1829, Smith realized that both printing and selling would be much harder than he thought, causing him to shift his revenue model yet again, this time, very late in the process, into establishing his own congregation so that he could collect offerings directly. But Smith was not very good at that either, so as soon as he could, he merged with Sidney Rigdon's much larger congregations in Kirtland, ostensibly 3 days after having met Sidney Rigdon. It's a little fishy. Between Smith and Rigdon, I would say that Rigdon was much more serious about, quote, combating the deists and the non-believers in his day. Rigdon was the one who wanted to shore up the Bible and calm down the sectarian strife over what the Bible says. He was the one who wanted to establish a new Jerusalem government and a modern-day city of Enoch. All these ideas came to Smith through Sidney Rigdon, who had been pursuing such themes, as we know from many well-documented sources, in and near Kirtland for several years, not the other way around. Okay, having represented Vogel's pious fraud theory in his own words, how are we to understand Archiantis under his assumption? There are essentially three explanations. Option number one, Smith constructed the word to mean anti-archaeology because he, like Spalding under my K5 subtheory, wanted to drop a subtle clue near the end of the book that only the most educated readers would pick up on. Under this explanation, Smith knew that Archiantis would undermine the seeming authenticity of the text to some extent, but he just couldn't help himself because perhaps as a slowly rehabilitating con man, it was more exciting to deceive people a little bit while giving them a hint of the deception, as if to say, if you're too stupid to pick up on this, then you deserve to be deceived. That's option number one. Option number two, Smith made up Archiantis without intending to give any meaning to the word. The apparent similarity to anti-archaeology or anything else was just a coincidence, which we should just accept because, quoting Mr. Vogel, coincidences happen more than people realize. Option number three, Archiantis means something totally different, like maybe anti-royal arch masonry. Although there is plenty of anti-Masonic sentiment in the Book of Mormon, there is nothing in the immediate context before or after the singular appearance of Archiantis to suggest that it itself had such an anti-Masonic meaning, but the possibility remains open. In my part 1 video, I showed how Spalding's writings were very anti-secret combination in the Fabius story and the Mormon story, anti-Catholic and anti-Masonic in several passages. Not just in the Fabius story, like I said, but also in the Mormon story and in other writings as well, like the Romance of Celeste, which I said to you earlier before we started. I don't have time to go into that now, but I do talk about it in this other video that you can find on my website, which is long, but in depth. The Smith family, in contrast, before and after 1830, was pro-Masonry. Okay, Mr. Vogel published the following statement after watching my part 1 video, quote, "Your comment that the Smiths were pro-Masons ignores Joseph Smith's 1831 letter to Hiram, who was still in New York and preparing to relocate to Ohio to, inner quote, beware of the Freemasons, close inner quote. Even in Nauvoo, he called them an apostate priesthood, close quote. No, Dan, my comment did not ignore Joseph Smith's letter to Hiram, which, by the way, was written on December 2nd, 1830, not 1831. Your comment, however, shows that you don't actually understand what Smith's 1830 letter was all about. Here is the actual letter from the Joseph Smith's Papers website. It says, quote, "Brother Hiram, beware of the Freemasons. McIntyre heard that you were in Manchester, and he got out a warrant and went to your father's to distress the family. But Harrison overheard their talk, and they said that they cared not for the debt, if only they could obtain your body. They were there with carriages. Therefore, beware of the Freemasons. This from yours, etc." So, Mr. Vogel, Joseph Smith was not telling Hiram to beware of the ideology, the beliefs, or the doctrines of Freemasonry. This letter from 1830 is not evidence that 3 years earlier, Joseph might have held some anti-Masonic views after getting the plates in the fall of 1827, or while dictating sentences to Martin Harris in early 1828. On the contrary, it is evidence that Hiram, who was a Mason, continued to associate with Freemasonry after the Book of Mormon had been dictated and published, and intimately enough to borrow a significant sum of money from certain Freemasons who got angry when he decided not to pay them back, rather than honestly pay down his debt, which is a pattern with Father Smith and Joseph Smith Jr. Hiram skipped town, just like father, like son, like brother, hiding from the authorities in Colesville before relocating to Ohio. Those Freemasons apparently were angry enough with Hiram that they had planned to seize him, carry him off in a carriage, and probably torture him, maybe tar and feather him, not knowing that he had already skipped town. Soon thereafter, Joseph sent a warning letter to Colesville admonishing Hiram to beware of the Freemasons. For whatever reason, Mr. Vogel knowingly takes that letter, the letter in question, way out of context, desperate, in my opinion, for any evidence, however late and out of context, that might suggest that Smith himself might have been somewhat anti-Masonic during the dictation process. No one else believes that. Cheryl Bruno, she's the expert on this. Joseph Smith and his family were pro-Masonic all the way through. It wasn't until the late Nauvoo period that Joseph Smith started showing anti-Masonic sentiments, only because he had already co-opted as much from Freemasonry as he probably could. Somewhat revealing is Mr. Vogel's statement, quote, "Oops, even in Nauvoo," which was like 9 years later, he called them an apostate priesthood. There is no evidence that Smith decreased in his pro-Masonry for the 11 years between December 1830 and March 1842, when he became a master Mason. 2 months after that, Smith revealed, as I'm sure all of us know, the temple endowment. It was only after Smith had appropriated all he could from Freemasonry that he started to assert that Freemasonry itself was an apostate priesthood and that he held the keys to the true Masonry. He didn't have a need for it after that. Such a late comment is certainly not evidence. In 1842, 14 years after the Book of Mormon started, no, that is not evidence that Smith might have held some anti-Masonic views 14 years earlier, and he cannot find one piece of evidence to suggest that he did. If he could have, he would have said it. He didn't, and the evidence that he did give was extremely poor on the topic. That is a very apologetic response, just like Vogel's apologetic response to my Kishkumen analysis, and he knows it, but he's using apologetic tactics because he doesn't have anything better, and he should be called out for it. No serious historian behaves this way. Usually when we use even in such counter-arguments, when stacking a good point on top of a prior good point, we don't use it for an irrelevant point on top of a bad point. So that's my response to Vogel's counterpoint. But Arantis is not the only Greco-Roman name in the Book of Mormon. Why did someone, Spalding or Smith, invent Laconius? And why does it have a hard CH sound the way that Lamech, Enoch, Zenoch, and Mulek do? Okay, Laconius clearly means a man from Laconia. According to Homer's Iliad, Laconia was an impressive kingdom ruled by King Menelaus of Sparta, the husband of Helen of Troy. If you don't know, Sparta was the capital of Laconia. Incidentally, Vogel has admitted publicly that Spalding was clearly influenced by the Iliad and the Helen of Troy story when writing manuscripts found. Changing the hard C within Laconia to a hard CH and adding the Latin suffix us was Spalding's attempt to slightly, but only slightly, disguise the famous name and make it all seem more biblical, per his well-established pattern in both the Fabius story and the Mormon story, like Lamech and Enoch. Under my K5 sub-theory, it makes all the sense in the world that Spalding would choose a name like Laconius for one of his erudite chief judges. We are told in 3 Nephi 3 that great and marvelous were the words and prophecies of Laconius. His proclamation went forth, quote, throughout all the face of the land, and the people, quote, did fear the words which had been spoken by Laconius. Perhaps Spalding meant to imply that his manner of speaking was laconic, a word that Joseph Smith probably never used. It certainly never appears in any of his known writings with or without a scribe, which I've checked. The invented name Laconius was yet another subtle but very telling clue to anyone who had read the Iliad that the Mormon story was intentional epic fiction in the style of his heroes. But how might we rationalize Laconius under Vogel's pious fraud subtheory? Again, there are basically three options. One, Smith was so influenced by the Greek city-state, whether through the Iliad or some other source, that he felt compelled to allude to it while writing his own epic fiction, even though that would anachronistically undermine its authenticity and therefore compromise Smith's greater purpose should anyone figure out what he was doing. Two, Smith invented Laconius somewhat randomly. Consequently, any connection to Homer or ancient Greece is just another coincidence for Mr. Vogel, who doesn't seem to care how big that pile of coincidences has become, and he never will. Or three, Smith earnestly believed that Romanized Greek names, like Laconius, were prevalent enough in Jerusalem in 600 BCE that they just might work for his story, as if Laconius and Archiantis had been engraved perhaps on the plates of Laban or some other apologetic excuse. But if Smith were even minimally educated on Jerusalem, he would have known that there was little to no Roman influence in Jerusalem 5.5 centuries before Pompey arrived in 63 BCE. But Smith was no 22-year-old antiquarian. For what it's worth, according to unreliable Emma, Smith didn't even know that Jerusalem had walls while dictating the Book of Mormon. To me, none of these three explanations are the least bit credible, but perhaps Mr. Vogel can put a better one in the comments as he defends his ever-weakening theory. And now we come to Helarum, the son of King Benjamin and the brother of Helam, as mentioned in Mosiah 1, verse 2. According to the poorly and hastily constructed Book of Mormon pronunciation guide, it should be pronounced Helorum. In the real world, however, it is properly pronounced Helarum. It is the name of a port city in Sicily, situated about a mile up the Elurus River, with a silent H. The most important role that Helarum played in ancient history is summarized by Cicero, whom Spalding had studied at Dartmouth College. At great length, Cicero explained how Gaius Verres, a corrupt and lascivious Roman magistrate, and his incompetent, inebriated admiral, Cleomenes, were ultimately responsible for the tragic burning of 6 Roman warships in the harbor of Helarum by Mediterranean pirates. Here's the full story in English on the left. Spalding, of course, would have read it in the original Latin on the right. Again, this is Cicero narrating the account, and this was required reading for like third-year students at Dartmouth. So, like Cleomenes himself, they steered for Helarum, not so much to escape being attacked by the pirates as to follow the lead of their commanding officer. Cleomenes had already reached the coast at Helarum, had already hurried ashore, and had left his great ship afloat. The captains of the other ships, finding that their admiral had disembarked, and aware that they could not possibly themselves either beat off the enemy or escape by sea, put in at Helarum and followed Cleomenes. Thereupon, the pirate chief Heracleo, thus suddenly and unexpectedly victorious, though not through his own valor, but through the iniquitous cupidity of Verres, seeing this fine fleet of Roman ships run ashore on dry land, gave orders as soon as darkness came on to set them on fire and burn them. What a pitiful, miserable episode in Sicilian history! What calamity and ruin for hundreds of innocent men! What a matchless piece of foul wickedness on the part of Verres! On one and the same night, we see the Roman governor burning with the vile fires of lust, and the Roman fleet burning with the flames that those pirates kindled. The best ancient authorship explanation that I've heard for the appearance of Helarum in the Book of Mormon is quite amusing, and I'm quite sure that 99% of your audience has never heard of an exploration for Helarum, so I hope this is interesting. I just find this stuff infinitely fascinating. But the best kind of apologetic explanation that I've heard is that the Mulekites might have stopped at Helarum for supplies on their way to the New World through the Mediterranean Sea, because that's the way they went, as opposed to the way that Lehi went, which was down and around, right, through the Arabian Gulf and then eastward towards the eastern coast of America. But no, maybe the Mulekites went through the Mediterranean Sea and they stopped at Helarum and they like wrote it down, and so they got onto the plates, and so that's how the name got preserved. How cool is that? I love this apologetics. Anyways, which King Benjamin might have learned after the Mulekites and the Nephites merged in the land of Zarahemla, and then decided to give that name to, one of the descendants of King Mosiah, the offspring. Under Vogel's Smith exclusive pious fraud theory, we again have 3 possibilities. 1, Smith had studied Cicero and knew that incorporating Helarum into his fiction would be anachronistic and therefore undermining to his purpose, but he did it anyways, because he wanted to, and he was doing it with other things, and he didn't think he would get caught, and kind of enhanced the fun of it all, being deceptive, but also pretending that it was all real. And that's the first option. The second is that it's just another coincidence, nothing to see here, so that's a good one for Dan. And 3, Smith randomly pulled Helarum off a map that he supposedly found somewhere, and for some reason, not knowing perhaps just how anachronistic it would have been, decided to go with it. A much better explanation is that at some point Spalding desired to have an alliterative sibling name to go with Helaman. Alliterative naming is quite common in literature, including epic literature. Think of Romulus and Remus, because it generates a feeling of onomastic harmony and some like ancient flavor to it. Now think of Laman and Lemuel. As I explained in my last video, Spalding probably constructed Helaman by adding the theophoric prefix ha to Laman, as if to change a bad guy name into a good guy name 500 years later. Or if you want to say that's what Smith did, well, you know, thought you can make that argument too. He probably also liked the fact that Helaman rhymed with Telamon, another hero from Greek mythology. But I suppose that Helemuel didn't sound very good. Where is it? There it is. To Spalding. So when Helaman came to his educated mind, he went with it because anachronistic names are not a problem when writing adventure or romance novels, which is what the Mormon story originally was. Pseudo-history, not pseudo-epigrapha. Of course, we can't know for sure that this is the exact reason why Helam appears in the Book of Mormon, but it is a far better explanation than you will see on BYU's Onomasticon or in any of the apologetic literature, including Fair Mormon, or that Hugh Nibley tried to put forth as in terms of an explanation. Cicero doesn't explicitly state whether the pirates who attacked Helam were the infamous Gadatanian pirates, but he does specifically mention that the chief pirate was named Heracleo, so it is a safe assumption. If you don't know, Heracleo is an archaic Spanish name for the Greek Heracles, whom we know as Hercules because of Roman influences. The Gadatanian pirates were so called because they hailed from Gades, Spain's most ancient city, which was founded by Hercules Gadatanus, mythologically speaking. In the same way that the Aeneid was the first attempt to write a national history of Italy, connecting Roman ancestry with the prestige of classical antiquity and fan fiction of the Iliad, quote, when the first attempts were made to write a national history of Spain, Hercules Gadatanus became a cave figure, connecting Spanish ancestry with the prestige of classical antiquity, which showed a remarkable amount of creativity on the part of Spanish historians, according to Profesora Fernandez at the University of Cadiz. Borrowing and altering proper nouns like Laconius, Helaram, and Gadatanian, which is the inspiration for Gadianton, being pirates and robbers, from the founding narratives of Italy and Spain, while writing his own ancient American ancestry, was Spalding's playful way of connecting the Native Americans with the prestige of classical antiquity, which in my opinion shows a remarkable amount of creativity on the part of Spalding, or Smith, if you really think he was that educated that he was able to do that. There are a lot more about robbers, proper names, and linguistics in my part 1 video, so if you're interested, please go and check that out. Among other things, for example, I give a much better explanation for where the word Liahona might have come from. But we're not to spend too much time on it, but if you string together the 4 most common suffixes in the Book of Mormon, or prefixes, then in this order, it makes Liahona. El, like is in Samuel, Lemuel, right? Aya, on, and ah. Put those suffixes in order, and you can see how prevalent they are. These are the top 4 suffixes. String them together in the right order, and it makes Liahona. And how do we know that L shortens to L? Because there are lots of examples in Greek of this happening in the Bible. Eleazar becomes Lazarus, becomes Lazarus. There are lots of examples of this. So I talk more about this in the other. If you're interested, I've got lots of other examples that I think are much better explanations than anyone has ever put out there for the proper names that exist in the Book of Mormon. So if you're a serious post-Mormon, I would really encourage you to go out there and do the deep dive.
Definitely done the deep dive. You have, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and there's lots more. But some of the stuff that I'm sharing here, I made sure that I didn't, that is new for this video, because I
Oh, that's
really
awesome.
respect your audience. I respect that you guys took a chance on me in April and that you're willing to invite people back, and really you care about, this is my perception about what you care about. You care about making the space healthy and open for dialogue for professionals and for amateurs. And I really applaud that. You know, I feel like there is in the post-Mormon space and with Word Radio and with what Mr. Vogel does, there's a lot of toxic male historicity going on, a lot of bravado, a lot of putting people down, a lot of making the space unsafe for people to share their ideas, to start the circulation of more ideas. It's really defensive, but it's not just defensive, it's offensive, because it is a form of toxic male historicity and it needs to stop. And I'm calling on people to put pressure on the community to do better. It's a lot of fun to have drinking games and to like put nasty things in comments when other people are presenting. I get that. That's a culture and that's comments. But I am asking the community to do better about making it a healthy space for people to share new ideas, because not all of the ideas are going to be right and perfect. Not all of the ideas are horrifically wrong. And I think that I'm bringing a lot of new information to the table, and maybe 90% of it's right. But most people would not continue doing what I'm doing if people like Dan Vogel were to severely mischaracterize their theory, misquote them, misrepresent and argue like an apologist, like you saw with the example with Kishkumen and other things that I've shown you early in this video. And that doesn't work on me, but it works on most people. And Vogel knows that, and I'm asking him to stop. Pretty pleased with sugar on top.
I feel like it's a whiteboard, you know, everybody comes from their place of their own scholarship and they throw things out there, you know, and I think most people do appreciate dialogue. I mean, like I said, we appreciate Dan, we appreciate Lars. Dan, I reached out to him and said, we're doing this podcast with Lars. He said, I am curious to hear what he has to say. I think you're curious, you know, you were curious to hear more about what Dan has to say. So consider us the middleman, right? Right, Landon?
And when you respond, Dan, just don't mischaracterize what I do. Give the facts, make your arguments. Don't be trite, don't be rude, don't be puerile, don't be a teenager. Be an adult, be a professional, act the way that you would want to be treated with scholar. It's the golden rule. That's a very simple ask. 7th graders understand it. Okay, so here I'm going to provide this.
After dictating the Book of Mormon and its 188 unique names, Joseph Smith continued to invent names in the Book of Moses and then in his Book of Abraham project, especially in the so-called grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. So we know Joseph Smith was quite capable of inventing names.
Okay. First of all, Joseph Smith didn't invent the names in what eventually became the Book of Mormon. Spalding did, but let's get on with it. Second, these 12 names from Vogel's scrolling list that you just saw were repeated for no good reason, making the unimpressive list seem longer than it actually was. Why did he do that? That's a question for you, Dan. Third, Ammon does not appear in the Book of Mormon or the Book of Abraham, so Mr. Vogel is mistaken about that too. Fourth, these 5 names from Vogel's list were not inventions, as Mr. Vogel wrongly claimed. They are directly copied from the Bible, so I'm crossing them off the list because I was talking and he was rebutting about names that Spalding or that Smith invented. Okay, so now let's look at the names that Joseph Smith did make up, starting with the Book of Moses. Hananiah is clearly an altered spelling of the biblical Hananiah in yellow. Haner probably comes from the biblical Hanes, and Henny probably comes from hen or henna. Not that impressive so far. Mehujael is an altered spelling of the biblical Mehujael. Mahijah and Mehuja seem to come from a table of name variants in Adam Clarke's Bible commentary on Genesis 4:18, according to Colby Townsend, who published on this, and our friends at the Interpreter Foundation in their article, quote, were the names Mahijah and Mehuja inspired by Adam Clarke's commentary? So they weren't invented by Joseph Smith if you're going with the Smith sole authorship theory. Also, recall that Professor Waymont and Haley Wilson of BYU concluded that when constructing the so-called Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, quote, Smith drew upon Clarke likely at the urging of Rigdon. We also know that Rigdon was Smith's scribe for the Book of Mormon project, which was happening concurrently with the translation of the Bible project. Mahan is probably a shortening of Mahanaim. Neither of these two very small name clusters in all of the Book of Moses, these are the only name clusters that are original. They are very small, and they are mostly taken from Adam Clarke's commentary of the Bible or directly lifted from the Bible. So it doesn't show a lot of creativity on the part of Smith. So Vogel shouldn't be using that as evidence that Smith was super capable at making up names. And it's all downhill from there. The names in the Book of Abraham are far worse, linguistically speaking. Let's start with my favorite, Shine Ha. When Smith felt like he needed a name for our sun in the Egyptian language, the word sunshine apparently came to mind, after which he convinced himself, or pretended to have convinced himself, that shine in English must have been conserved from ancient Egyptian. He then slapped on the same ha, H-A-H ending, that Spalding had ubiquitously used in the Mormon story, and called it good. Then
one of his stars is Shin Fliss, Shineflis. When he named 15 stars, I guess he liked that.
I love, and you and I, we're always on the same wavelength. And of course, I've seen all of your Mormonish episodes, and I love the episode where you go deep into it. And so
I love it.
But you're right, right here. So he takes Shine Ha, and then what does he do? Like he makes Shine Fliss.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then just Fliss.
And
that's
then,
another star. He's like, Fliss.
Did you make my slides? Look at this.
I just happen to have those stars memorized because I find it so absurd.
Me too, because I get into it and I can't. It's so funny. Smith is so bad at making up names. He's nothing like Spalding in terms of creativity and linguistic capability. Nothing. So Shine Fliss, then Fliss, then Floes, then Floese, and Flossis, and Cleflossis. I mean, I just love it. Smith just throws in some hyphens as if that would add any credibility to his clusters. Cleflossis with new hyphens. It's just so ridiculous. Now look at Kokob and Kokob beam and Ha Kokob beam with Ha. With Hi being a prefix now for the very first time. And once again, there are more superfluous hyphens. This is Smith being consistently stupid. It's nothing like Spalding. Recall that in the DNC, the super secret code name for Oliver Cowdery was Oliha, which I'm sure nobody figured out. Regardless, these Ollie names are not terribly surprising. Shem, Olashem, Limha, Olimha. Oneida obviously comes from Oneida, a hill in Spalding's Mormon story. So Shem, of course, comes from the Book of Mormon and comes from the Bible. Limha comes from the Book of Mormon. So Spalding, Smith is like, I need to make up some names. He goes to the Book of Mormon, he picks a couple of names, and he's like, Olimha. Yeah, he's just being stupid. It's so transparent, to me at least.
I always felt like when he was naming the stars, he was looking around the barnyard like wagon o oxon, I see a wagon, I see an oxon, right? Yep. Wayne's World. I mean, was there someone there named Wayne?
Well, and Wayne's County was where he was living at the time. Wayne's County, right? So come on. He's just
Zip.
He's bastardized.
Did the zipper even exist? I don't think so.
Sechem is derived from the biblical Sechem. Did I put that on here? There we go. Shul. Oh, where is it? Sechem from the biblical Sechem. Jah-o-ah is clearly a very crude bastardization of Jehovah that he thought nobody would figure out. Elkanah comes from Elkanah, not crazily creative there. And Egyptus, almost comically, comes from Egypt, as if there had been a Roman influence on Ham's mother-in-law. Come on. The Book of Abraham is only 5 chapters, and yet it took Smith 7 years to complete. The scale, purpose, and methods resulting in the Book of Abraham were very different from those that resulted in the Book of Mormon, implying that they were created by different processes so different that different people is the more likely, less complex, more simple explanation there. When Smith was pressured into producing ancient scripture that wasn't already pre-composed, he either suffered a 7-year writer's block, or more likely, he simply didn't have the skill. Remember that Smith and Oliver Cowdery got through 7 pages in just one day when it comes to the Book of Mormon. But here it takes him 7 years to do 7 pages. Why? Because it wasn't pre-written for him. That's why Smith took so long and didn't really produce much of anything. And what he did produce was, as we know, bastardization of Genesis, with the mixed in stuff from commentaries like Adam Clarke, with just the smallest amount of, there isn't hardly any progression of plot. He doesn't develop the names of any of the characters, and it's super short. There's, like I say, there's no development. There's very little creativity. Again, furthermore, none of the names in the Book of Abraham column involve character development, plot, or backstory. Many of them appear just once in the explanation of a figure or in a list. The names in the Book of Mormon, in sharp contrast, are not anywhere near so linguistically puerile. They are developed because they were written by someone else. Joseph Smith, was no linguist by any stretch of the imagination. He thought that amen, which in real life means so be it, came from amen. Sorry, why is that? Came from amen, which supposedly meant God in the Adamic language. Son amen, so Smith taught, meant the Son of God, really bright. And angels in the Adamic language were called, if you can believe it, amen angelsmen, as if son and angels had meant son and angels in ancient Egyptian. These constructions are just as bad as Smith's explanation for Mormon, meaning more good, as if more, M-O-R, had the meaning of more, M-O-R-E, in ancient Egyptian as well. No, the more in the Book of Mormon was influenced by Macpherson, which Spalding knew about, Smith didn't know about, and influenced by Mormon, Monmore, Nephi, Kircher, all of that stuff, which we've already talked about. Now recall Dan Vogel's words, quote, "So we know that Joseph Smith was quite capable of inventing names," close quote. Quite capable? Not in the slightest. Vogel's belief that Smith was quite capable of making up names does not absolve him from the responsibility of looking closely at the quality and context of those names. It is yet another example of what I call surface level thinking. The names in the Book of Mormon came from a very different mind than the one who generated Izinsba, Limdi, Ablesicism, Venisti, Vusel, Wayne, Waganoaxen, with equal signs instead of hyphens, Oansley, Sabel, Shibble, and Zip. No, this is the level of creativity and intelligence of Joseph Smith, totally unaware that his words were neither the bigliest nor the best. Joseph Smith is like Donald Trump is today. I'm so smart. I'm just the smartest. My friend from so-and-so says that I'm the smartest. I have the bigliest words. I have the best vocabulary. Everybody says that I'm so smart. No, you don't have the bigliest words. You don't have the best vocabulary. Gotta own it. And it's time that we saw Joseph Smith for who he was, and it's time that we honor and praise the right man, who is not Joseph Smith, he's Solomon Spalding. In contrast, the names in the Fabius story and in the Mormon story evidently come from the same mind, which was the mind of Solomon Spalding, which was educated, linguistically trained, and deliberate. And that is where I will wrap up today's presentation, which was admittedly very heavily focused on the linguistic stuff that I told you I put in that 4-hour video that you can find on my website, and to some of the stuff that I was trying to rebut from Dan Vogel's response, two-part response to that video. And I've got lots more responses coming, so I'm not dodging certain things. I'm just trying to, put them together thematically in ways that make sense and that are entertaining to the audience, and that are not opening cans of worms that I don't have time to address all the nuance for. So please be patient with me as I create more videos and address these types of complaints. To give you just a sense of what I'm working for on my next video, which I can publish and then we can talk again, or I can give to you and we can do here. I'm open to all kinds of possibilities, as you know. I'm very grateful you're generous hosts. But right now I'm working on my next response to Mr. Vogel's straw man response to my work, which I hope to release in the coming weeks. So if you want, you can head over to my YouTube channel at How It Came to Pass and subscribe so that you can watch it as soon as it comes out. To give you a sense of what to expect, I plan to address the following issues. More about Joseph Smith's education, observations made by William Davis, Mr. Vogel's arguments about the grammar of the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript, and how he thinks that that argues for Smith's sole authorship when in fact it doesn't. I'll undo the arguments that he's made in other places and show how they're weak. The mechanics of Smith burying his face into a hat, how that works with this, my version of the Spalding, Rigdon, Smith theory, better than with the Smith sole authorship theory. I'll talk about the way in which Vogel tries to mischaracterize my chapter on the priority of Messiah as if I disagreed with what Brent Metcalf had written. And I take Brent Metcalf's analysis to a deeper level and show how it supports how the 116 pages were rewritten, but that the original 116 pages had elements written by Spalding. I talk more about the wherefore therefore pattern that exists in the Book of Mormon, which is really fun. It was discovered before Brent Metcalf, and I've taken that analysis to a deeper level than what was published by him or by Vogel. And then debunking Vogel's argument that the text must have been an exclusively oral composition. He gives evidence for that he says are very definitive that the text was orally composed, which isn't true. It's evidence that there was an oral dictation step, but that doesn't serve as evidence that there was an oral composition step. There was a written composition followed by oral dictation, which is what Smith did with his scribes, and I show how that's more consistent with the evidence. And then finally, debunking. I reserve the right to add a few more things to this next presentation, but this is what's in there for sure. And debunking Vogel's argument that the character of Mormon is Joseph Smith's alter ego, as if it were autobiographical, but it's not. And I can show the reasons why his argument fails on several and has actually some hypocritical elements to it that I show where he contradicts himself in what he said in different podcasts. So hopefully all of that will be interesting to people. I'm open to questions, from you guys and from anybody else. I'm doing my best. That's all I can say.
And that's great. Wait, am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Sometimes I can't tell. So no, and I love that list that you gave us, because I feel like, don't you think, Landon, we've touched on a lot of those things in different podcasts from other presenters who have different points of view. You just put it all out there, and our audience is so smart. You know what I mean? And they can understand this kind of stuff. They can make their own decisions about it. They can look into it further. It's a catalyst. Ooh, can I say catalyst? With for people looking farther. And as I said before, we so appreciate Lars. We very much appreciate Dan. It's interesting to see your back and forth, because you're both knowledgeable and the rest of us can learn all kinds of things. And like I said, we've had other presenters that have touched into a lot of these things too. As you were going down the list, I was like, that's right, so-and-so mentioned that, and so-and-so talked about that, or that person had a different point of view, but I wonder what Lars is, back and forth. So it just makes me excited to try to dive into all this. What do you think, Landon?
And you guys can make us better, right? Because I get emails all the time. You guys get emails all the time.
Yeah.
And it changes our minds. So when you have these great thoughts while you're in the car, pause the podcast, tell yourself, Siri, remind me tonight at 9 p.m.
Look into this
to Mormonish, or to put a comment, because you make us better. You make the field better. There aren't enough Mormon historians who listen to these podcasts. And so it's not percolating. It's not, but we need to create a movement around it. And you can do that. Your comments matter.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. What do you think, Landon?
I like how we get to see different views, because I keep oscillating between these different views. I've said, I don't believe that. And then I say, it's clearly an oral dictation. Then I go back and I see, maybe it does have aspects of Smith's life weaved into it, and I can see that. And so I keep going back and forth as I listen to this. I think you say kind of the best for last there. The name thing was, to me, very interesting there, because we've had Dr. Lundwall on, and he's trying to show that it's that the Book of Mormon times was a written history. It was all about writing, and then you get the church's people out there saying, "Oh, no, the Popol Vuh was written, and they could write the same." And then you read the Popol Vuh and what it says, and compare it to what the Book of Mormon says, and you say these are not the same.
Right.
And I kind of felt that way with your names. You're kind of going, yeah, these names are not the same. These are not the same quality. So that makes me think, okay, where did Smith get the names from? So
I also love those podcasts that you guys have done where you were trying to look at the names and where they might have come from, and bodies of water and the narrow neck of land between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, Rama and some of the others. I felt like as it's so funny because I listened to the podcast and I'm the guy that literally has to pull over and write things down and give my.
You are that guy.
I'm doing that because I love you, because it comes to me because you touch on all the right topics and you ask the right questions of your guests. Was it the intent of the original writer of the Mormon story that his civilization be a reading civilization? That was his intent. His intent was that King Benjamin would give a sermon and they would write it down and they would give it out and people would read it and re-speak it and stuff. And in the Fabius story, that also written by Solomon Spalding, it's very clear that he intended this to be a literate society and capable of writing, and that had an evolution from ancient writing, and that the stories were layered in, from manuscripts found and then more manuscripts found. And so they are all connected. But the idea that the Mormon story, the Mormon pseudo-history, it was intended by the writer for it to be a writing-based civilization that has anachronistic problems with real history,
completely, yes.
but it was the intent of the writer. So all this apologetic nonsense about, it was Spalding's intent that both the societies in the Fabius text and in the Mormon story were very written and interesting and educated people who had devolved into a light-skinned versus dark-skinned race, but they still had been a written and prolific and educated societies.
Yep, there was a lot there. I have to laugh because we're actually taping this kind of late at night. All of us are like, we have time late at night. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'll probably just go to bed after this. Now I'm like, I got to look something up. I'm looking at this little list. So yeah, you definitely make people think, Lars, and that is a good thing. Whether people, discount everything or, have all of a sudden maybe think, maybe there's something to this part of it. There's nothing bad about that. There's nothing bad about that. And I think that's what we're saying here. So I love it. And I hope that we'll link all the things that you talked about in the show notes. So if anybody's like me and this has sparked something, whatever part of it, go to Lars's channel, go do your own research. Let's try to look at all this more and in different ways. And I just think it's great.
Yep. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been a real blast for me. And I'm sorry that it took a month for us to get here, but I'm so glad that we were all patient on all sides.
Yes. Thank you, Lars. It was up to you because the rest of us were falling apart. Like I said, every time I would get better from something like a tooth infection that wouldn't go away, then Landon's like, oh, no, we're not kidneys. So we're like, are we too old to podcast anymore? Are we?
Yeah. We had some holidays in there, but it's great. I'm really appreciative. And I'm really excited is this going to air Wednesday night probably, or?
It'll either be on a Tuesday or a Friday, and I will let you know. We're usually booked the week ahead, so it'll probably be like 2 weeks after this. but we'll let you know for sure, and we'll put everything together. But is this your final statement here? Is that it?
Oh, I just put this up here for people who are in the know, who've seen the battle and the
right
a little bit. We don't have to spend very much time on it, but one of the first things that Dan saw when he saw my little teaser video from my website, he wrote, "Kircher didn't write the Book of Mormon," and so I responded to that saying, "Hi Dan, of course he didn't. That is not my claim, but someone did put Kircherisms into the Book of Mormon. How did they get there?" So I was trying to be polite, but he had watched my video, and of course I didn't make that claim, and I'm not sure why he made that comment but anyways, so this is how Dan Vogel started engaging me within this whole process. And so I explained that. And then he says, "Stop with the Spalding theory. It's crap. Stop with the sensationalism. It's just as bad as Mormon apologists." And that just made me smile. So I had to respond. anybody who claims to be a serious historian and says that we need to stop with this sensationalism and throws in it's crap, like in his response, like he's the one using charged rhetoric. He's the one, so it's just as bad as Mormon apologists. I'd say, be careful what you say, because maybe that's what's going on with you, Dan. So work on that maybe a little bit. So I say, hi, Dan, it's also possible that there's a sub-theory that you haven't considered that's more parsimonious than the other sub-theories or theories. So the reason why I bring this up is because he knows, he always knew that, because I told him, I set the record straight, Kircher didn't write the Book of Mormon, but he sent that misinformation out into the internet and he never corrected it. And then on his rebuttal video to me, he writes in his little description at the beginning, in the intro to the video, he writes, does Nielsen establish his new version of the old Spalding theory? Did a 17th century Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher contribute to the Book of Mormon? Can these bold claims stand up to serious scrutiny? Watch this video and find out. Well, guess what? I never made the claim that Athanasius Kircher contributed in any way to the Book of Mormon, but Dan knows how people are going to read this. He knows that I already corrected him multiple times online, but he doesn't seem to mind throwing it out there. Oh, it's just a question. He sounds like someone from Fox News. I'm just asking the question. Did Athanasius Kircher contribute to the Book of Mormon? But then he makes the mistake. He's not careful with himself. He says, can these bold claims that Kircher wrote the Book of Mormon is not a claim I made. So he's not only being careful, but he's deliberately misrepresenting me, and he's using it in the intro to his video nonetheless, despite the fact that I pointed out to him twice in other comments that he responded to that wasn't my claim and that this behavior is inappropriate. Then guess what happens? Ward Radio decides to do an analysis of my book. They didn't read my book, but what they did do was read and watch snippets of Dan Vogel's review, so to speak, of my book. And in it, they quote Dan saying, wait, like, what is Lars doing? Well, let me summarize it. Lars Nielsen's theory, according to Mr. Vogel, is that Athanasius Kircher was this Jesuit priest, and he contributed to the Book of Mormon, and through Spalding, through Rigdon, it all got down into Joseph Smith. Ward Radio mischaracterizes my theory, but we'd expect that from them. They're a bunch of tools. But they didn't read my Book of Mormon. They didn't read my book, and they didn't watch any of my videos. But what they did do was only watch sound bites of Dan's video and then quote Dan as if he were an authority of my video. So now there are lots of Mormons everywhere. I get emails from Mormons almost every day. I get something saying, why do you think I didn't say that Kircher wrote the Book of Mormon? You're getting that bad information from Ward Radio, who's not doing their homework, who's getting their information from Dan Vogel, who is intentionally misrepresenting a theory. None of these people are acting the way that they should. So I'm asking everyone to do better.
That is interesting, because I tried to watch a little bit of the Word Radio episode because I saw us on it, right? And it said something like, post-Mormons go crazy for new theory. I'm like, well, that's not accurate either. We take in new information. We go, I'll have to research that out in my own mind and see what I think and look at all the different sources. None of us do that right away. Like, oh my God, this is it. I mean, we're very skeptical as post-Mormons. We are. Wouldn't you agree, Landon?
We even said that in the first interview with you. We said, this is the claim you're making. We said, be ready for post-Mormons to go after you, because that's what we do. We question it, we'll read it, and then we'll start questioning it. So, but they left that part out.
They left that part out, and I noticed that on their clips they showed of me, I'm just going, it looks like I'm totally, but I just kind of nod and go, that's interesting. Mostly, I'm just taking mental notes and going, I'm going to check that out. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean I agree. I'm going to think about it.
We're doing the best.
It's all very interesting. I love it. I feel like this is like the battle of the network stars, the back and forth. I know you're in the middle of it, and and I've talked to Dan too, and everybody has their opinions and points of view, but I just hope that the scholarship wins out overall and everybody will just look into things. And I hope people in the comment, I hope Dan's in the comments and has been in the comments here. And I hope everybody's engaging, because I think that's what we're trying to create. Wouldn't you say, Landon?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yep, I think that's it. So perfect. All right. I think this is going to be one of our longest episodes just because there was so much to
Definitely.
go through, but it went really fast. I mean, I was absolutely fascinated by the linguistics. When you had the Latin translation and the English, I was trying to see if I could still read Latin. So if everyone saw my eyes crossed, it was because I was going, yeah, I still could kind of do it. I'm rusty. I'm going to have to dig into some books. But anyway, so thank you, Lars, for coming on. It's just been wonderful again. And thank you, Landon, for co-hosting. Please, everybody, comment. I'm sure you have been, because everything that's said here is just interesting. And like we said, go research everything. Go look into everything. Check out Lars's videos. Check out Dan's videos. Let's just get a dialogue going and see what's going on. So did you have one more thing to say, Lars?
And subscribe to Mormonish.
There it is.
And give some money to the super chat.
That's it. That's it. Lars says it. There you go. Yeah, I always say that. Please like and subscribe. And I always say there are links in the show notes. We're a nonprofit. Making a donation is really fabulous. We love that and appreciate everybody that does. We even have Mormonish merch. You can even get a mug or something. But anyway, thank you again, everybody, for hanging in there with us. And I hope this really just sparks a lot of things. I hope that you do look at Dan's information and Lars's information and do your own research, because that's what it's all about. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on Mormonish. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.